He slammed the door so hard the windows rattled in their frames. Dr. Harlan Voss didn't even look back at the woman he'd just destroyed. He simply straightened his coat, tucked his medical bag under his arm, and walked out of that courtroom like he hadn't just spent 40 minutes systematically dismantling another human being's entire life, her training, her judgment, her worth, in front of everyone she'd ever known. Like it was nothing. Like she was nothing. Eliza Rowan sat alone at that table for a long moment after the room emptied. 30 years old, hands folded, back straight, and absolutely nowhere left to go. If that had been you sitting in that chair, everything you'd built, everything you'd sacrificed for, taken by someone who simply had more power and less conscience than you, what would you have done? Before we go any further, if stories like this one speak to something real in you, something about dignity and grit and the kind of love that finds you when you've stopped looking for it, please hit that subscribe button and stay with us until the very end. Drop a comment below telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. And if it moves you, hit that like button. It means more than you know. Now let's go back to where it all began. The storm came without warning, the way the worst things always do. One moment, Silas Mercer was pushing Thunder hard along the ridge trail, trying to make Caldwell Pass before dark. The next, the sky opened up like something had been torn loose from it. Not rain exactly, more like the mountain itself was wringing out whatever it had been holding back all season. The kind of storm that doesn't announce itself, the kind that just arrives and starts taking things. Thunder was a good horse. 15 years and Silas had never once doubted that animal's footing. But the path along the eastern ridge of the Bitterroot was not a forgiving road even in dry weather, and tonight the shale had turned to something closer to soap. Silas felt the shift before he heard it. A subtle wrongness in Thunder's stride, a hesitation in the back left quarter, and then the horse went down sideways with a sound that Silas would carry in his chest for years afterward. He hit the ground hard, tasted blood. Lay there for a second in the rain and the dark, listening to Thunder scream. And that sound was worse than anything. Silas had heard men scream. He'd heard dying men make noises that didn't sound human. But his horse screaming in the dark on a mountain trail in a storm was something else entirely. He got to his feet before he fully knew he was standing. His left side told him something was cracked, a rib, maybe two, but that was a problem for later. Thunder had gone still, which was either a relief or the beginning of something Silas refused to think about yet. He knelt in the mud beside the horse and ran his hands along the left leg by feel alone, and what he found made his stomach drop. The pastern, swollen already, wrong angle. Easy, he said, not because Thunder could understand him, but because Silas needed to hear a voice, even his own. Easy, boy, I got you. He did not have him, not really. He was a man alone on a mountain in a storm with an injured horse and visibility dropping to nothing, and the nearest town was 12 miles back through terrain that had just proved itself hostile. He had his rifle, his saddlebags, and approximately no good options. What he did have was the smell of wood smoke. He almost missed it. The rain kept swallowing everything. But it was there. Faint, coming from somewhere below and to the north, which made no sense to him because he'd ridden this territory for 11 years, and there was nothing up here. Nothing. He'd have known. Apparently he didn't know everything. It took him the better part of an hour to coax Thunder down from that ridge. The horse was frightened and in pain, and Silas was cold and hurting and operating on stubbornness alone. Twice Thunder balked completely, and Silas had to stop, press his forehead against the animal's neck, and just breathe with him for a while until something settled. That was their whole relationship, really, summarized in those 2 moments on the mountain. The horse pulling back, the man holding on, neither one willing to quit. The light, when it finally appeared, was amber and low. A window. A real window with a real lamp burning behind it. The building that resolved itself out of the dark and rain was modest. A timber frame house that had been built with obvious care but no pretension, with a barn to the east and what looked like a large garden plot running along the south side, all of it surrounded by a fence that had been recently repaired. Silas noted that without thinking about it, the way a lawman notes details. Recent repair. Someone here was paying attention to things. He knocked, or tried to. His knuckles barely made sound against the door. He was wetter and colder than he'd realized, and his hands weren't cooperating the way they should. He knocked again, Harder. The door opened. The woman who stood in the light was not what he expected, though he couldn't have said afterward what he had expected. She was around 30, dark-haired, with the kind of direct gaze that some people find unsettling and others find clarifying. She was holding a lamp in one hand and what appeared to be a medical journal in the other, and she looked at him the way someone looks at a problem they're already calculating how to solve. "Your horse," she said. Not a question. "Left foreleg. He went down on the ridge." "How long ago?" "Hour. Maybe more." She was already pulling on her coat. "Barn's around that side. Get him inside and I'll be right there." She disappeared back into the house, and Silas stood in the rain for a moment with the strange feeling that he had just been given orders by someone who had not asked him a single thing about who he was or where he'd come from or what authority he carried. Just, "Barn's around that side, get him inside, I'll be right there." He found himself moving. The barn was warm and dry and smelled of hay and something herbal he couldn't name. He got Thunder into the nearest empty stall, and the horse was shaking, which worried him more than the leg. Shock, maybe, or just the cold. Silas didn't know enough about horses to know which. The woman appeared minutes later, and she was not alone. An older woman followed her, 60s, broad-shouldered, with white hair pulled back and an expression that suggested she had seen a great deal of life, and remained largely unimpressed by most of it. "My mother, Margaret," the younger woman said, already kneeling beside Thunder, her hands moving over the injured leg with a confidence that Silas recognized, the same unhurried certainty he tried to project when he was diffusing a bad situation. "I'm Eliza." "Silas Mercer." "I'm the Marshal." "Yes." She didn't look up. "I can see the badge." Margaret set a lantern on the stall post and stood back, arms crossed, watching her daughter work. She glanced at Silas once, briefly, with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Sit down before you fall down," she said to him. "You're favoring your left side." "I'm fine." "You're cracked, probably 2 ribs, and you've been standing in rain for over an hour." She said it the way someone states the weather. "Sit down." He sat. Eliza worked on Thunder for a long time without speaking. She had supplies with her that she'd clearly grabbed quickly: bandaging, some kind of poultice that smelled sharp and medicinal, a small bottle of something she administered in Thunder's water. Her movements were efficient but not rushed. She never seemed uncertain, even when she paused to think, which she did twice, both times going still with her hand resting on Thunder's leg, like she was listening to something only she could hear. "He'll live," she said finally. Silas let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding. "The pastern is badly sprained, possibly a minor fracture. I can't be certain without more light and time. He can't be moved for at least several days, likely more." She stood, wiped her hands, and looked at him directly for the first time since she'd started. "Which means you're staying." "I have responsibilities and—" "I'm sure you do," she said, and there was nothing unkind in it, just an absolute flat factuality. "And Thunder has a leg that won't carry you back to them for a while. So." She picked up her supplies and headed for the barn door, stopped, turned back. "There's a spare room in the house. It's not much. Supper was an hour ago, but there are leftovers." She paused. "I said that wrong. I'm not— You're welcome to stay, is what I mean." Something shifted in her expression, just briefly, like a door opening a crack and then reconsidering. "He's a good horse. He trusted you to get him somewhere safe. That matters." She left. Margaret lingered a moment, gathering the extra lantern, giving Silas the particular look of a woman who has just witnessed something that interests her. "She doesn't give compliments easily," the older woman said quietly. "Keep that in mind." Then she followed her daughter out into the rain, and Silas sat alone in the barn with his injured horse and the faint smell of that herbal poultice, and the slow, strange realization that he did not know this woman's last name, did not know how long he would be here, did not know anything except that something had just shifted in the landscape of his life, and he couldn't yet tell if it was good or dangerous or both. He slept in the barn that first night. He told himself it was because he wanted to keep an eye on Thunder. That was partially true. The other part was harder to admit, that he didn't quite trust himself in that house yet, in that warmth, with those 2 women and their particular brand of calm competence. He'd spent so long in a world where warmth was something you kept your guard up around because it made you soft, and soft got you killed. But the barn was dry, and Thunder's breathing steadied around midnight, and Silas Mercer, 36 years old, 12 miles from his jurisdiction, 2 cracked ribs, and considerably more tired than he'd allowed himself to feel in years, finally slept. He woke before dawn to the sound of someone moving in the barn. Eliza, she was there with a lantern, crouched beside Thunder's stall, checking the bandaging with the same quiet focus she'd had the night before. She hadn't heard him wake. He watched her for a moment, not in any way that would embarrass either of them, just watching the way a person moves when they think no one is looking, which tells you more about them than anything they say. She was worried. He could see it in the set of her shoulders, the way her hand rested on Thunder's neck just a second longer than necessary. She was checking the horse, yes, but she was also just being there with him, keeping him company in the dark. That hit something in Silas he hadn't expected. "How is he?" he said. She startled, only slightly, quickly controlled. "Better than last night. The swelling is down some." She didn't apologize for being there, didn't explain herself. "You should sleep. The ribs will feel worse before they feel better." "I've had worse." She looked at him then, a long, measuring look. "I'm sure you have." Not dismissive, just taking him in. "That doesn't make what you have now hurt less." He didn't have an answer for that, which was unusual for him. She stood, brushed hay from her knees, picked up her lantern. In the doorway she paused. He noticed she did that, paused in doorways, like she was always giving herself one last moment to reconsider. "I'll make coffee at first light," she said. "You take it with anything?" "Black?" A faint, almost smile. "The first one." "Good. I only have black." And she was gone again, and the barn was dark and quiet, and Thunder breathed steadily in the stall, and somewhere outside the rain had finally stopped. Silas lay back in the hay and stared at the ceiling of the barn and thought about the fact that 3 hours ago he had been almost certain this night would end with him putting a bullet in his horse's head. And instead here he was, dry, breathing, with someone's daughter checking on his animal in the pre-dawn dark because she'd decided he was worth checking on. He tried to remember the last time anyone had decided that about him. He couldn't. Breakfast was quiet. Margaret cooked with the focused economy of a woman who had cooked 10,000 meals and stopped having opinions about it somewhere around meal 3,000. Silas sat at the table and felt, with some discomfort, the specific awkwardness of sitting at a stranger's breakfast table in a storm-wet Marshal's coat, ribs aching, hat on the peg by the door, suddenly very aware that this was not his home and he didn't know the rules of it. Eliza came in from outside. She'd been back out to check on Thunder again, even before eating. And she sat down across from him and poured herself coffee and didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "I want to try a different poultice this afternoon, something with comfrey root. It works better for the bone involvement." "You think it's fractured?" "I think it's possible." She wrapped both hands around her mug. "I'd rather treat for the worst and be wrong than assume the best and have him re-injured. That's—" He stopped. He'd been about to say that's exactly what a good physician would say, and he realized, just barely in time, that it might sound condescending, that it would imply he'd expected something less from her. "That makes sense," he said instead. She looked at him like she'd heard the version he hadn't said, and had made a note of the version he had. "Yes," she said, "it does." Margaret set plates in front of both of them and sat down at the head of the table and said, completely unprompted, "How long have you been Marshal?" 11 years. "You like it?" Silas picked up his fork, considered the question with more seriousness than it probably warranted. "I'm good at it." "That's not what she asked," Eliza said, not looking up from her plate. He looked at her. She was eating, expression neutral, like she hadn't said anything particularly pointed, like she just happened to notice, in passing, the difference between being good at something and liking it. "No," he said after a moment. "I suppose it isn't." Margaret nodded like something had been confirmed. Eliza said nothing more. Outside, the morning light was coming through the window, thin and cold and perfectly clear after all that rain. And somewhere in the barn, Thunder shifted in his stall. And Silas Mercer sat at a table with 2 women he'd met 8 hours ago and felt, for the first time in longer than he could calculate, like he was somewhere that expected something honest from him. He wasn't sure yet if that was a relief or a threat. He finished his breakfast and found out slowly, over the days that followed, that it was both. The ribs were worse by the second day. He'd known they would be. Margaret had told him so with infuriating accuracy, but knowing didn't make the particular misery of taking a deep breath any more pleasant. He tried to help with the morning chores and managed about half of what he intended before he had to stop and stand still for a moment with his hand pressed to his side and his dignity somewhere on the ground nearby. "Fence posts," Margaret said, appearing beside him with the calm inevitability of a woman who had been expecting this. "You can do fence posts, standing upright, one side, no twisting." "I wasn't planning to." "You were planning to try and haul water, and I've seen that look before." She handed him a hammer. "Posts, south side." He spent the morning on fence posts. It was not glamorous work. It was also, he realized around the third post, exactly the right kind of work for a man with cracked ribs. Rhythmic, manageable, forward-facing. His mind went quiet in a way it rarely did. He didn't have to think about the 3 open cases on his desk in town, or the trouble that had been brewing down near the Henderson Ranch, or the way Deputy Colt had started looking at him lately, like he was wondering how much longer the old man intended to stay in the job. He just drove posts. Around noon, Eliza appeared with a tin cup of water and what turned out to be a piece of cornbread, which she held out to him without ceremony. "You eat?" "Not yet." She handed it over and sat on the top rail of the fence and looked out at the mountains, which today were so clear and sharp they looked almost invented. He ate the cornbread standing up because sitting down with cracked ribs was a whole project. And after a moment she said without preamble, "How'd you get the scar on your neck?" He touched it reflexively. "Old habit." "Knife fight. Billings. About 6 years back." "Did you win?" "I'm here." "The other man?" "Also here." "I took him in." He paused. "He was 17. Did 3 years, came out. I heard he's ranching over by Missoula now." Something shifted in her face, just slightly, like a door opening a crack and then reconsidering. He'd seen her do that before, and he was starting to understand that it meant she was revising her opinion of something. Of him, probably. "You could have said you won," she said. "I did win. That's what winning looks like." She looked at him for a moment, and for a second he thought she might say something real, something from whatever was behind that careful, measuring expression she wore like armor. But she just nodded once and slid off the fence rail. "I'm going up to the North Woods this afternoon," she said, "for comfrey, and a few other things." She hesitated. "The trail's easier than the ridge, if you want air." It was the most careful invitation he had ever been extended, like she'd wrapped it in 3 layers of practicality just in case he rejected it, so the rejection couldn't reach her. "Sure," he said. She nodded, didn't smile, walked back toward the house. He finished the fence posts. The North Woods were something else. He'd spent 11 years in this territory, and somehow he'd never been in this particular corner of it, this quiet stretch of old growth above the Rowan property, where the light came through in long shafts and everything smelled like pine resin and cold water, and something green he couldn't name. Eliza moved through it like she'd grown up here, which she hadn't. She told him that without him asking, just offered it as information. "We came up here 3 years ago," she said, "after Mill Haven." She said the town's name, the way you say the name of a place you didn't leave voluntarily. "What happened in Mill Haven?" A long pause. She was crouching over a low plant with broad leaves, checking the roots with careful fingers. "Dr. Harlan Voss happened," she said. She didn't say more than that. Not yet. He had the instinct, the same instinct that had served him reasonably well in 11 years of law work, to not push, to let the silence sit until she decided what to put in it. What she put in it was, he made a mistake, man died. Instead of owning it, he made it mine. Simple as that. Said flat, without anger, which was somehow worse than anger would have been. "And they believed him," Silas said. "He had 30 years in practice, and I had 4. She stood, added the plant to her basket. "He was respected. I was convenient." She moved to the next plant. The inquiry lasted 2 days. I wasn't permitted to present my case notes. They weren't considered relevant. Silas felt something cold move through him that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "How old were you?" 26. He was quiet for a moment, then, "That's a hell of a thing to carry." She looked at him, surprised maybe, or evaluating. "Yes," she said, "it is." They walked for a while without talking, which Silas found unexpectedly easier with her than with most people he'd known for years. She had a particular quality of silence that wasn't demanding anything from you, just quiet, present, not waiting for you to fill it. "My wife died," he said, eventually. He wasn't sure why he said it. He hadn't talked about Claire in better than 2 years. 8 years ago, fever. Eliza stopped walking. "I'm sorry," she said. And she said it the way his mother used to say things, like she actually meant it, without the extra layer of performance that people usually put on top of sympathy to protect themselves from it. "She was the one who said I should take the Marshal position," he said. "Before. She said I had a face people trusted, which was a kind way of saying I was too stubborn to back down." A small pause. "After she died, I kept doing the job because I couldn't think what else to do." Is that still why? He thought about Margaret asking him whether he liked the work, and Eliza noticing that he hadn't answered the question. He thought about how nobody in Caldwell had asked him anything real in a long time. "I don't know," he said, which was the truest thing he'd said in months. She nodded. Didn't try to resolve it for him, didn't offer comfort he hadn't asked for, just received it, the way the woods received sound. Absorbed it. Let it be what it was. They came back down the mountain as the sun was angling toward the ridge, her basket full of plants he couldn't name, his ribs aching less than they had that morning, and something between them that hadn't been there before. Nothing dramatic, nothing declared, just a thread of something, thin and careful, stretched across the space between two people who had each lost more than they talked about. Margaret had supper waiting. She looked at them when they came in, at the basket, at Silas's face, at her daughter's face, and said nothing, which Silas was beginning to understand was how Margaret communicated the things that mattered. Thunder ate well that night. Eliza reported it at the table with the particular restraint of someone who was relieved but refused to show how much. Silas looked at his coffee and thought, the leg will heal, eventually. He'll be able to ride. And then he thought for the first time about the fact that he wasn't entirely sure how he felt about that. He pushed the thought away. It was early, and the ribs still hurt, and he was a practical man. He had always been a practical man. But Margaret, across the table, caught him looking at her daughter and said nothing, and smiled into her coffee with the particular expression of a woman who has been watching people her whole life and knows exactly what she's seeing. The third morning, he tried to saddle Thunder. Not to leave. He wasn't fool enough to think the horse was ready for that. Just to check the fit of the bandaging under pressure, to see how Thunder reacted to the weight of the tack. It was a reasonable thing to do, a practical thing. Silas told himself that as he was doing it, which should have been his first warning, that it wasn't entirely reasonable or practical. Thunder told him himself. The horse shifted the moment the saddle came near the injured leg, a sideways flinch that was small but absolute, and Silas stopped immediately, hand on Thunder's flank, and stood there in the early cold of the barn, feeling the particular shame of a man who has pushed when he should have waited. He told you no. Eliza was in the doorway. She had her coat half buttoned and her hair not fully pinned yet, which meant she'd come straight from the house without finishing her morning, which meant she'd seen him through the window and come out because she knew what he was doing and why it was a bad idea. He didn't know how she'd known. He was starting to understand that she noticed things the way he noticed things, constantly, involuntarily, whether she wanted to or not. I know what you weren't going to do. She walked past him, ran her hand along Thunder's neck, checked the wrapping on the leg with quiet efficiency. You were seeing how close you were to being able to leave, and the answer is, not close. She straightened. 3 more days before we can even assess the bone properly, possibly more. Silas put the saddle back on the rail. I have a job. You have a horse that can't carry you. She picked up the feed bucket, not looking at him. Those aren't the same problem. The man I'm tracking doesn't know the difference. She stopped, set down the bucket, turned to look at him with an expression he hadn't seen from her yet, something sharper than her usual careful measuring, something with a little more edge. Who are you tracking? Man named Cutter, Dutch Cutter. He's been moving through this territory for 6 weeks. 3 robberies, 1 dead, and that we know of. Silas leaned against the stall post, crossed his arms, felt his ribs remind him not to do that too firmly. He goes to ground when it rains. He'll surface again, and when he does, I need to be where I can move." Eliza was quiet for a moment. "And your deputy?" "Colt is good. He's also 23 and hasn't faced anything like Dutch Cutter." He paused. "He doesn't know he's not ready. That's the part that worries me." She considered that. He could see her filing it away, the same way she'd filed away the 17-year-old from Billings. The way she accumulated information about people not to judge them, but to understand what they were carrying. "3 more days," she said finally. "That's what I'm asking. Let me do a proper assessment in 3 days, and then we'll know what we're actually dealing with." "And if it's worse than you think?" "Then we'll know that too." She picked up the feed bucket again. "Not knowing is worse. You're aware of that. It's why you're standing in a barn at dawn testing a horse that already told you no." He didn't have a response to that. She was right, which was a sensation he was encountering fairly regularly around her and hadn't yet decided how to feel about. 3 days, he said. 3 days. She fed Thunder, and Silas went back inside, and Margaret had coffee waiting with the expression of a woman who had heard the whole conversation from the kitchen window and was not going to say a single word about it. He poured his own coffee and sat down and said nothing, and Margaret said nothing, and after a moment she pushed the cornbread in his direction, and he took it, and that was the closest thing to an acknowledgement that either of them managed. It was a quiet household. Silas was used to quiet. He'd lived alone for 8 years, but it was a different kind of quiet than he'd known. His quiet was absence. Theirs was presence, full and particular, like the house itself was paying attention. He kept catching himself listening to things he hadn't noticed before. The sound of Eliza's pen moving in the evenings when she was writing in her journals. The way Margaret hummed low to herself while she worked and stopped immediately. If she thought someone could hear her, the particular creak of the third step on the stairs that told him what time each of them went to bed. He was paying too much attention. He knew it. He didn't stop. The 4th day, he helped Eliza harvest. It was not planned. He'd been doing fence posts again. Margaret had found him more fence posts, which he suspected was deliberate, because she was a woman who understood that idle men in pain make bad decisions. And Eliza had come past with her basket and tools, headed for the garden, and he'd looked at his hammer and looked at the fence and then just followed her without quite deciding to. She didn't say anything about it, just handed him the second basket and pointed at the row of plants she needed him to pull. They worked for 2 hours in the morning light, and it was not glamorous and it was not comfortable. His ribs objected to the bending. And it was also one of the more peaceful mornings Silas had experienced in recent memory, which bothered him when he thought about it, and so he tried not to think about it. "You know what these are?" he asked, looking at the bundle of roots he'd just pulled. "Valerian. It helps people sleep." She was a row over, focused on something with small purple flowers. "And before you say anything, no, I don't put it in the coffee." He hadn't been planning to say that, but he also couldn't be entirely certain he wouldn't have eventually. "What made you start?" "The healing." She sat back on her heels. He'd noticed she did that when she was deciding how much to answer, sat back slightly, like she was physically making room for the decision. "My father got sick when I was 12, she said. "Slow sickness, over 3 years. The doctors that came to us some were fine, some were not. One of them was actively harmful and didn't know it." She moved to the next plant. "I started paying attention to what worked and what didn't, started reading everything I could find. By the time my father died, I knew more than the last doctor had, and I was 15. A pause. "That's not pride. It's just what happened." "Did it help?" "Knowing more, I mean, when he died." A long beat. "No," she said, "but it gave me something to do with the grief." She looked at him across the row of plants. "I suspect you understand that." He did. He understood it exactly. He'd put on the Marshal's badge 3 weeks after Claire's funeral and barely taken it off since, because motion was the only thing that felt like not drowning, and he'd been in motion for 8 years, and somewhere along the way, he'd stopped noticing that he was running. He hadn't said any of that, but she looked at him like he had. "Yeah," he said. "I understand that." They finished the harvest, and she sorted everything on the workbench in the barn with a focused precision that was satisfying to watch, grouping by type and purpose, labeling in her small, neat handwriting. He sat on a hay bale and watched, and didn't pretend he was doing anything else, and she didn't tell him to go do something useful, which felt like a kind of permission. "Voss," he said eventually, The doctor from Millhaven. What happened to him? The motion of her hands didn't change. He's still practicing, she said. Still respected. Got a bigger office last I heard, on account of there being one fewer healer in the territory to compete with him. The dryness in her voice was almost humor, but not quite, something that had learned to dress like humor. And nobody, flat, final. He had the inquiry. The inquiry found no wrongdoing on his part, and that was the end of it. Who was the man who died? Frank Alderman, rancher, 61 years old, 3 children. She tied off a bundle of dried herbs. He had a systemic infection that Voss was treating as a stomach ailment. I saw him twice. Frank came to me because the medicine Voss gave him wasn't helping. I identified what I believed was the actual cause, told him so, suggested a different course of treatment. She set the bundle down. He went back to Voss and told him what I'd said. Voss changed the treatment. But he changed it wrong. Too aggressive, wrong compound. And Frank deteriorated and died inside a week. She was quiet for a moment. Voss's notes showed my recommendation as the course of treatment he'd followed, which made the error mine. The cold thing moved through Silas again, slower this time, more complete. He changed the records. He adjusted the records, she said, with a precision that was more devastating than anger. He was very careful about the word change. Everything he wrote was technically accurate in the way that certain true things can be arranged to mean something completely false. She finally looked up. And I had no notes of my own from those 2 consultations because they'd been informal, because he was the doctor of record and I was a healer. People came to on the side, and I hadn't thought to document myself. A long breath, the only thing that cracked the surface. I've thought to document myself every day since. Silas looked at her for a long moment. You should have had a lawyer. I had no money for a lawyer. I had 4 years of practice and no official certification, and a dead man whose family blamed me because that was easier than blaming a man they'd trusted for 30 years. She turned back to her sorting. So, we came up here, and we built this. And it turns out there are enough people outside of Millhaven who care more about results than credentials. Something like satisfaction moved under her voice, quiet but solid. Voss doesn't know about them. He will eventually. I know. She tied another bundle. I'm not hiding. I'm just elsewhere. Silas understood elsewhere. He'd been living in duty the way some people live in elsewhere. Not hiding exactly, just perpetually located somewhere that wasn't fully real, wasn't fully felt. He'd thought it was strength. He was beginning to wonder. He was quiet for a while, and she let him be quiet, and thunder shifted in his stall, and outside Margaret could be heard moving around the yard doing something practical that didn't require comment. For what it's worth, Silas said finally, I believe you about what happened. Eliza's hands went still for just a moment, then resumed. You never met me before 3 days ago, she said. No. You have nothing to base that on except what I told you. I have how you work, he said, and how you talk about what happened. And the fact that you're up here in the middle of nowhere with a barn full of medicine and a mother who quit her life to come with you, because people like you don't make things up. They just keep going. He paused. For what it's worth. She didn't say anything for a long moment. It's worth something, she said. Very quiet. Like it had come from further back than she'd intended. She tied off the last bundle and took her basket inside, and he sat in the barn a while longer with his hands on his knees and his ribs aching and the strange, uncomfortable warmth of a man who has just given something away without calculating whether he could afford to. He sat there until it didn't feel so strange. Then he went inside for supper. Margaret had made stew. She put a bowl in front of him and sat down and looked at the two of them the way she always looked at them, like she was reading a book she'd read before and still found interesting, and said, without looking up from her own bowl, Silas, did you ever learn to play chess? No. Good. Eliza cheats. I do not cheat, Eliza said. I play aggressively. You hide your queen behind your mother's pieces and then act surprised when it appears. That's strategy. That's cheating with extra steps. Silas looked between them and felt something loosen in his chest that he hadn't known was tight. Not the ribs. Something else. He ate his stew and listened to them argue about chess in the comfortable way of people who have had the same argument many times and enjoy it. And he did not say much, but he laughed once, a real one, brief and unguarded, at something Margaret said about the Queen, and Eliza looked at him across the table with an expression he'd never seen from her before. Like she hadn't known his laugh until right then, and now that she did, she'd remember it. He looked away first. The evening settled around them, and he thought about Dutch Cutter, and about Colt being 23 and unready, and about the cases on his desk and the life that was waiting for him 12 miles away. He thought about all of it with the diligence of a responsible man, and then he watched Eliza argue with her mother about chess, and thought about that too, with a diligence that surprised him. He went to bed at the usual hour and lay in the dark with the creak of the house settling around him and tried to remember the last time he'd laughed at a table. He couldn't place it. That was a long time ago. He told himself to sleep. He told himself for a while. Eventually, he managed it. The fifth day brought rain again, lighter than the storm that had stranded him, more the kind of persistent drizzle that settles in the mountains and changes everyone's plans without drama. Silas spent the morning inside, which was unusual and slightly uncomfortable. He was a man who moved. Stillness felt like something was wrong. He ended up at the table with Eliza's medical journals. Not because she'd offered them, not because he'd asked. They were just there, stacked at the end of the table where she'd left them, and he'd been sitting with nothing and picked up the top one and opened it and found himself reading. Her handwriting was small and precise, which he'd expected. What he hadn't expected was the voice of it. Most official records he'd seen in his career were flat: date, fact, outcome, flat. Hers were different. She wrote about patients like they were people, which sounds obvious but wasn't in his experience. She wrote about Frank Alderman. He found it about 20 pages in and read the whole entry twice, slowly, and by the end of it he was very still. The entry was detailed, clinical in the right places, and also completely human. She'd written about Frank's hands, that he had the hands of a man who'd worked cattle for 40 years, that he'd been embarrassed about how weak his grip had gotten, that he'd made a joke about it to cover the embarrassment. She'd written about his daughters, who came with him the second time and sat in the corner quiet with worry. She'd written her clinical assessment and her recommended course of treatment and her concerns about Voss's approach, all laid out in clear language that any competent physician could have followed. And at the bottom, in slightly smaller writing, as if she'd added it later, he died on a Thursday. His oldest daughter sent word. I have thought every day since about whether there was anything more I should have done. Silas closed the journal. He didn't put it back. He sat with it closed under his hand for a while. There was no good response to what he'd just read. Nothing to say, no action to take, nothing that addressed the fundamental wrongness of what had happened to her in Mill Haven. He knew that. He also knew that not being able to fix something didn't mean you had to look away from it. He was still sitting like that when Eliza came in from wherever she'd been, shook rain off her coat, and stopped when she saw him. She looked at the journal, looked at his face. How far did you get? She said. No accusation in it, just a question. Frank Alderman. She hung up her coat, came to the table, sat down across from him. She didn't take the journal back. She put her hands around a coffee cup that had been sitting there going cold and looked at the table and was quiet. I should have asked before reading, he said. Yes, she said, but I don't mind. A pause. I think I left them there, partly because I wanted someone to. He hadn't expected her to say that. That's the entry I've rewritten the most, she said. I had 3 earlier versions. One was angrier, one was more clinical. I stripped out the personal parts, tried to make it just facts. The third one, she stopped. The third one blamed me, in ways I don't actually believe were warranted, but that I was feeling very strongly at 4 a.m, about 3 months after it happened. She looked up at him. This is the one I kept. I don't know if it's the right one, but it's the true one. He looked at her across the table. She looked tired this morning, which was new. She usually presented a kind of sustained energy, like she ran on purpose rather than rest. And it made her more real to him somehow, the tiredness. It reminded him that she was carrying things. The part at the end, he said, about whether you could have done more. Yes. Could you have? She was quiet for a moment. No, probably not. He needed a hospital, and there wasn't one. She turned the coffee cup in her hands. But that's not what the question is really about at 4 a.m. At 4 a.m, the question is whether if you'd said something different at a different time in a different way, whether the whole thing could have gone differently. And the answer to that version of the question is that you can never know. and not knowing is its own particular hell. Yeah, Silas said. I know that version of the question. She looked at him. Man I was moving to arrest, he said. 2 years into the job. He ran. I didn't chase him because I had 3 others to deal with, and he seemed like the least dangerous, and I made a call. He picked up his coffee, looked at it. He killed a family outside of Butte 6 months later. Woman and 2 kids. I've never been certain I couldn't have stopped it. She didn't fill the silence with comfort. She let it sit, the same way he'd let hers sit, and it felt like the most respectful thing anyone had done for him in years. You made the best call you had information for, she said eventually. So did you. They sat with that for a moment, the weight of it even between them, not comfortable, but not wrong. 2 people who had each been given a question with no good answer and had learned to carry it rather than put it down. I'm going to check on Thunder, she said finally. I'll come. She didn't say yes, didn't say no, just put down the coffee cup and pulled her coat back on. He followed her out into the rain, neither of them saying much, and they spent 20 minutes in the barn with the horse who was the reason both of them were here. And by the time they came back inside, something had shifted between them that Silas didn't try to name. Because the moment you named something like that, it became either something you pursued or something you had to pull back from, and he wasn't ready to know which one it was. Margaret looked at them when they came in, looked at the journal still on the table, looked at Eliza's face. Lunch, she said. They sat down. Thunder was better, day by day, incrementally, with 2 steps forward and 1 back. There was a morning in the middle of the 2nd week when he tested the leg wrong and went briefly lame again, and Eliza spent 3 hours in the barn recalibrating the treatment with a focused urgency that showed Silas more clearly than anything else how much she'd invested, not just professionally but personally, in the horse's recovery. She didn't say that. She would never say that. But he watched her work and he understood it. What he also understood, watching her, was that her investment wasn't about him. It was about the horse. Thunder had trusted the process, had submitted to the treatment, had been patient in the way animals are patient, which is more complete and less calculated than human patience. She was not going to let that down. He thought about that for a while afterward, about what it meant, as a principle, to be that committed to the thing in front of you regardless of its relationship to you. She would have worked this hard on any horse. He was fairly certain of that. And somehow that made him feel more respected, not less. He was thinking about odd things. He noticed that. The 11th day, Margaret asked him to help her move a storage shelf in the small back room where she kept the organized records of every patient Eliza had treated since they'd been on the mountain. The records were meticulous. She showed him briefly, not to impress him but because the work required him to know where things were being moved. Each folder labeled, each entry dated and cross-referenced. Hundreds of them. She sees a lot of people, Silas said. She sees everyone who comes. Margaret directed him to set the shelf against the north wall. She doesn't turn anyone away, even when they can't pay. That's a lot of work. It is. Margaret handed him the first stack of folders to replace on the shelf, organized by year. She did it in Millhaven too, before Voss. She had a real practice, not a barn, a proper room in town, people coming regularly. She was building something. A pause. She doesn't talk about what she lost when Voss did what he did. She talks about what she built afterward. But I was there for both, so I know the difference. Silas stacked the folders carefully, aware that each one was a person. She doesn't seem bitter, he said. Not a challenge, just observing. She's not, Margaret said. Bitter is when you stop. She didn't stop. She handed him another stack. That's not the same as not being hurt. She was hurt. She is hurt. She's just louder than it. She looked at him steadily. You understand that kind of person. He thought about that. Yeah, he said. I think I do. Margaret nodded, satisfied, and said nothing more on the subject. That evening, after supper, Eliza brought out the chessboard and set it up without ceremony and looked at him across the table. Mother says you don't know how to play. She says you cheat. She says a lot of things. Eliza set the board between them. Do you want to learn? He looked at the board. He had never had time for chess. He had never particularly wanted to make time for it. He looked at the woman across the table who'd just spent an hour quietly working in her journal, and who had, at some point in the last 11 days, gone from being a stranger who'd taken in his horse to being
something he didn't have clean words for. "Sure," he said. She taught him.
Methodically, practically, without talking down to him or over-explaining, she seemed to have a sense for exactly how much information he needed at once, which he suspected was the same skill that made her good at what she did. He played badly, which was appropriate for a first game. He played with slightly more intention than random chance, which she noticed. "You're thinking 3 moves ahead," she said, studying the board. 2. Maybe. No, 3. She moved her bishop. "You made a sacrifice there that only matters in 3 moves. Most beginners don't do that." "Marshal work," he said. "It's mostly reading ahead." She looked at him across the board. "How many moves ahead do you usually think?" "Depends on the situation. Average bad situation, 4 or 5. Very bad situation, more." He looked at the pieces. "Very bad situations tend to have fewer possible moves, which makes it easier." "That's counterintuitive." "Yes." She considered that the way she considered things, turning it over. In medicine, it's the opposite. Very bad situations have more variables, not fewer. Then how do you manage them? She moved her queen. You stop trying to control the variables and start responding to the ones that matter. She looked up. "Same as you, probably. Just different shape." He moved a pawn, thought about it, moved it again in his mind before committing. "I suppose." He lost. Substantially. She was gracious about it in the way of someone who has won many times and finds nothing interesting about winning itself, only about the game. She reset the board and raised an eyebrow, and he said yes without being asked, and they played again. He lost again. Slightly less badly. "Progress," she said, dry. "Give me a week," he said. She looked at him, and there was something in it. The week. Some awareness of what that meant. That he'd said a week as if a week were something available to them. As if time were not the thing currently sitting between them, like a held breath. She looked back at the board. "You'll need it," she said. Margaret came through the room on her way to bed, saw them at the board, said nothing, and went upstairs with the particular expression of a woman who had stopped being surprised and started being quietly pleased. The night settled over the ranch. Outside, the mountains were dark and enormous and indifferent to any of it. To the marshal and the healer and the injured horse and the careful thing growing in the space between 2 people who each had very good reasons not to let it. Silas walked back to the barn to check Thunder one last time before bed, as he'd done every night since the first. He stood in the stall with his hand on the horse's neck for a while, in the dark, the way you can be honest with an animal in ways you can't with people. "Getting better," he said to Thunder. Thunder pressed his nose briefly against Silas's chest and then turned back to his hay. "Yeah," Silas said. "I know." He stood there in the quiet of the barn for another few minutes, the night air cold and clean through the gap above the stall door, and thought about Eliza's face in the lamplight, and the chessboard, and the medical journals, and the particular way she'd said, "It's worth something, quiet," like she hadn't meant him to hear the weight of it. He was a practical man. He had always been a practical man. But he had also been alone for 8 years, and alone had started feeling less like a choice and more like a sentence. And he wasn't sure when that had happened, but being here, in this barn, on this mountain, with these 2 women who'd built something real out of nothing and refused to quit, it made 8 years of motion feel like what it had always been. Running. He'd have to leave. Eventually. Thunder would heal, and the badge was waiting, and Dutch Cutter was out there somewhere in the wet and the dark, doing things that needed stopping. All of that was real and waiting and not going anywhere. But tonight, for the first time in a long time, the waiting didn't feel like the whole story. He went inside, said goodnight to no one in particular, went to bed. In the morning, Eliza was already in the barn before him, checking Thunder's leg, her breath fogging in the cold air. And when she heard him come in, she said without turning around, "He took weight on it this morning." "Yeah?" Just for a moment, but clean, no flinching. She stood up and turned to face him, and there was something in her face, not quite a smile, she was careful with smiles, but something. "It's going to be all right." He looked at her across the stall. "I know," he said. And he was talking about Thunder, mostly. She held his gaze for exactly 1 beat longer than she probably meant to, and then looked back at the horse, and the morning went on around them, ordinary and cold and full of small things, and neither of them said what was also true, because some things you say only when you're ready, and neither of them was ready yet, and that was all right. For now, that was all right. The chess game became a nightly thing without either of them deciding it would be. There was no conversation about it, no agreement reached. It just happened the way certain things happen when two people occupy the same space long enough and stop working so hard to maintain the formal distance between them. Gradually, then suddenly, then so naturally that it became difficult to remember the version of the evenings that hadn't included it. Silas lost 5 games in a row. The 6th game he nearly won, and Eliza had to think for 11 minutes on one move, which he counted without obviously counting, and when she finally moved, he saw that she'd found the escape he hadn't spotted, and felt simultaneously annoyed and impressed, which seemed to be his baseline emotional state around her. "You've played before," she said, studying the board after she'd won. "I told you I hadn't." "I know what you told me. I'm telling you what I see." She looked up. "You adapt too fast for a beginner. Either you've played before, or you think in a way that maps directly onto chess, which is possible, but less likely." He was quiet for a moment. "My wife played," he said. "I watched, mostly. Never sat down with her." The almost silence that followed was different from other silences between them. It had a particular weight. "Why not?" Eliza asked. "Because she was better than me, and I had a hard time with that when I was younger." He said it straight, no softening, the way he'd learned to say true things he wasn't proud of. "I told myself I wasn't interested. That was easier." Eliza looked at the board. "And now?" "Now she's gone, and I can't ask her for a rematch." He moved a piece, not strategically, just for something to do with his hands. So, she didn't fill that with anything. Just let it be what it was. A man acknowledging a particular kind of regret, the specific grief of things you could have had and chose not to, for the small vanity of not wanting to be seen as less than something. She understood that shape of loss. She had her own version. "For what it's worth," she said finally, "you're better at it than you probably would have been then." He looked at her. "Because I lost some pride." "Because you lost some pride," she agreed, and there was no cruelty in it. Just two people recognizing what life costs and what you get for the payment. Margaret came through on her way to refill her tea, took in the scene at the table, and said without pausing, "You both look like you're trying to solve something that isn't on the board." She went back to the sitting room. Silas and Eliza looked at each other across the chess pieces, and then back at the board, and neither of them responded because there was no good response to a thing that Accurate said out loud. The letter came on the 14th day. It came with a rider, a boy of about 16 from the nearest relay point, a half-day's ride away, who handed over a sealed envelope with Silas's name on the outside and the look of someone who'd been told the delivery was urgent. Silas read it in the yard, standing, in the thin morning light. It was from Colt. 3 sentences. Dutch cutter had been seen in the territory again, 40 miles south of Caldwell, moving fast. A family had been robbed 2 nights prior, the husband beaten badly enough to need a doctor who wasn't available at close range. Colt was asking whether to move on it or wait. Silas read it twice, folded it, put it in his coat. He went directly to the barn. Thunder was standing easy, weight distributed well, eating without the careful caution of an animal managing pain. He looked better than he had any morning yet, but better was not ready, and Silas knew the difference between what he wanted to be true and what was true. And that had always been one of the few disciplines he'd managed to keep. He was standing there working that out when Eliza appeared. She'd seen the rider from the window, apparently, and had given it 20 minutes before coming out, which told him she knew what was in the letter before he'd said a word. "Cutter?" she said. "Yeah." "How bad?" "Bad enough that Colt is asking, which means he's worried, which means it's probably worse than what he wrote down." Silas looked at Thunder. "How is he? Honestly." She came to stand beside him, assessed the horse with the focused quiet she brought to all of it. "Honestly, the leg is healing well, better than I expected at this stage." She paused. "But I wouldn't put him on rough terrain for another 5 days minimum. Flat ground, slow pace, short distances. That he could probably manage now. But the ridge trail back to Caldwell is none of those things." 5 days. Silas worked the math. Cutter moved fast, struck and disappeared. Colt had good instincts but not enough experience with that particular kind of predator. The kind who looks disorganized and isn't, who seems panicked and is fully in control. "If I write back," Silas said, Tell him to set a perimeter. Don't engage directly. Wait for backup from the Henderson County Marshal. That buys us time without Colt moving alone. Can you write from here? If you have paper. I have paper. She was quiet for a moment. You could also... She stopped. What? Nothing. Go write your letter. Eliza, she looked at him, something careful moving behind her eyes. You could stay the 5 days? Let Thunder heal properly. And then go. A pause. I wasn't going to say it because it's not my decision and it's not my place, but you asked. It's not nothing, he said. You had a thought. I have a lot of thoughts, she said. I'm selective about which ones I say out loud. He understood that about her. He'd been watching her navigate it for 2 weeks. The gap between what she thought and what she said. How she maintained it as discipline rather than deception. How she'd occasionally let something through when she'd decided he'd earned it. He found himself wanting to be on the earning side of that more often, which was its own kind of information. The 5 days makes sense, he said, not just because of you, because of the horse and because of the tactical situation. Moving with an impaired horse against a man like Cutter is more liability than asset. I know, she said. I just didn't want you to feel like I was keeping you here, somehow. She said the last part to the horse rather than to him. You're not keeping me here, he said. A pause. No, she said. I know. But she said it in a way that acknowledged the small weight of both things being true at once, that she wasn't keeping him, and that he wasn't entirely sure he needed keeping to want to stay. He wrote the letter. The writer took it back. Silas spent the rest of the morning doing the things he'd fallen into doing. The fence work, the hauling, the small maintenance tasks that the ranch generated in steady supply, and tried to be a practical man about the situation and mostly succeeded. That afternoon, a wagon came up the mountain trail. He heard it before he saw it, wheels on the rocky upper path, moving fast, which was wrong, because no one moved fast on that path unless something was wrong. He was in the yard when it came into view, and he had his hand near his rifle by instinct before he made sense of what he was seeing. A ranch wagon. A man driving with the particular desperate focus of someone covering ground they don't have time for. A woman beside him with her hand on the back of the seat, holding something wrapped in a blanket, which was when Silas understood this wasn't a threat. He went to meet them as they came to a stop in the yard, and the woman looked at him with the wrecked expression of a mother who has been in the same state of controlled terror for long enough that it's become her default face. We were told there was a healer up here, the man said. He was in his 40s, weathered, hands shaking on the reins. Our boy. We've had the doctor in Mill Haven. He saw him twice, said it was a fever, gave him something, but he's not better. He's worse. He's a lot worse. How old? Eliza was already there. Silas hadn't heard her come out. 7, the woman said. His name is Thomas. Eliza was already at the side of the wagon, pulling back the blanket without ceremony. The boy inside was small and very still, the way sick children get still when the fever has been going long enough to exhaust even the restlessness out of them. His color was wrong. Not just fever flush, but something underneath it, grayish, the color of a fire burning through its last fuel. Silas watched Eliza's face as she looked at the boy. Watched it go through several things very fast. Assessment, calculation, something that was not panic but was close to its productive cousin. Then it settled into the particular steadiness she put on when the situation required it. Get him inside, she said. Margaret? She raised her voice toward the house, and Margaret appeared in the doorway like she'd been waiting, which she might have been. They moved the boy inside, and Silas stayed in the yard with the father, whose name turned out to be Ray Greer, and who had the hands of a man who worked his land hard, and the face of a man who would trade every acre of it right now for his son to be all right. He told Silas the whole story in pieces, the way people do when they're running on fear and exhaustion. The fever that started 6 days ago, the trips to Mill Haven, the doctor who'd been confident, and then quietly less confident but still confident in front of them, the 2 different medicines that hadn't worked, the morning when the boy had stopped eating entirely, and Ray's wife had said we're going up the mountain, and that had been the end of the discussion. The doctor in Mill Haven, Silas said carefully. What was his name? Ray Greer looked at him. Voss. Harlan Voss, you know him? Something moved through Silas that he kept entirely off his face. I know of him, he said. Go inside with your son. He stood in the yard alone for a moment after Greer went in. He thought about Eliza at 26, sitting alone at a table after a courtroom had emptied. He thought about Frank Alderman's hands and his daughters, and the way Eliza had written that entry 3 times before she'd gotten to the true one. He thought about Voss adjusting records with the particular careful dishonesty of a man who knew exactly what he was doing and trusted the architecture of his own reputation to protect him. And now, a 7-year-old boy. He went inside. The kitchen had rearranged itself around the emergency, the way the household always rearranged itself when Eliza was working. Things moved to create space. Margaret positioned exactly where she needed to be, the mother sitting against the wall with her hands in her lap, in the posture of a person who has been told to stay back and is holding herself together by main force. Eliza was examining the boy with total concentration. She'd removed his jacket and shirt with careful efficiency, and Silas saw her pause, a very small pause, the length of a caught breath. And then her hands moved to the boy's left side, lower ribs, probing gently. "Thomas," she said, quiet and direct, "I'm going to press here. Tell me if it hurts." The boy made a sound, small, exhausted, but clear. "Okay," she said. "That was very brave. You're done with the hard part." She sat back slightly, looked at Margaret. Some communication passed between them that had no words. "What is it?" The mother, her name was Clara, Silas had gathered, was on her feet. "He has a wound," Eliza said, "on his left side under the ribs. It's been there for a while, weeks possibly. It's infected." She kept her voice level, not to minimize but to sustain the room's ability to function. "The fever is the infection. The medicines Voss gave him were treating the fever as a primary condition rather than as a symptom." She looked at Clara directly. "He was treating the wrong thing." The silence in the room lasted exactly 2 seconds. "Can you fix it?" Ray Greer asked. "I can treat the infection," Eliza said. "I need to clean it properly and pack it, and then we manage the fever from the source rather than the surface. It's going to be a long night." She paused. "But yes, I can fix it." Silas watched Ray Greer's face do something complicated and private that he looked away from, watched Clara Greer press both hands over her mouth. He moved to the doorway of the kitchen, partly to give the family the moment, and partly because he was trying to think past the particular anger that had arrived in his chest when he'd heard Voss's name, which was not useful at this moment, but was very present. Eliza was saying something to Margaret in a low, quick voice, listing what she needed, and Margaret was moving. Clara had found her way to her son's side and was holding his hand, and Thomas, who had been mostly still, opened his eyes at her touch, just briefly, just to confirm she was there, and then closed them again. Silas went back outside, stood in the yard in the late afternoon light, looking at the mountains. He could feel the anger working in him, steady and hot, the way anger does when it has legitimate fuel. Voss had seen this boy twice. Twice. A 7-year-old child with an infected wound showing up with a fever was not a complex diagnostic puzzle, not for anyone paying attention, not for anyone who was actually looking at the patient instead of managing the situation. Voss had not been looking at the patient. Voss had never, apparently, been looking at the patient. He thought about what Eliza had said. He was treating the wrong thing. He went back in when he heard his name. Not called loudly, just his name said at normal volume through the kitchen door, which he'd left open. Eliza was in the kitchen doorway. "I need you to help hold him still," she said. "Ray's going to be 2. He loves his son too much. Margaret will handle the materials. I need someone steady." "I'm steady," he said. She looked at him for a beat, something that was somewhere between gratitude and assessment, then nodded and went back in. He was steady. He'd been steady in situations considerably worse than this. Situations with blood and noise and men who were not small and not sick, but actively trying to kill him. He held Thomas Greer still with firm, gentle hands and talked to him quietly while Eliza worked. Not about anything in particular, just the steady, low murmur of an adult voice saying, "It's all right. You're doing well. I've got you. You can squeeze my hand if you need to." And Thomas squeezed his hand twice, hard, and then went limp with exhaustion and relief when the worst of it was over. Eliza worked without pause for 2 hours. Silas had watched surgeons work, had watched battlefield medicine in the early part of his career when the territory had been less settled and more violent, and what he saw from her was as competent as anything he'd seen. No wasted motion, no hesitation, no performance of confidence, just actual confidence, the kind rooted in knowledge deep enough that it doesn't need to announce itself. When it was done, Thomas's color was already slightly better. It was too soon for the fever to break. That would take time. But the grayness had retreated. Margaret cleaned up with quiet efficiency. Eliza stripped off her apron, washed her hands at the basin, and stood for a moment with her back to the room and her hands on the edge of the basin and her head slightly down, and Silas recognized that posture. It was what you looked like when you'd been holding everything tightly for hours and were allowing yourself exactly this amount of release before pulling it back together. He'd stood like that himself, many times. Clara Greer, who had been permitted to sit close throughout and had held herself together with extraordinary discipline, let go of it now. Quietly, not dramatically. Just a few tears she didn't bother to manage while she held her son's hand and looked at his face. Ray stood in the corner looking at nothing in particular, which was what men did when they were very grateful and had no language for it. Eliza turned around. She was composed, but the tiredness was through it now, visible. "He needs to stay tonight," she said. "Possibly 2 nights. The fever will break in its own time, and I need to monitor the wound." She looked at both of them. "You're welcome to stay. There's a pallet in the back room." "We're not leaving him," Clara said immediately. "I know," Eliza said. Not as a correction, just as an acknowledgement. She knew mothers. Then that's settled. She went to make tea because that was what she did when things were settled. Moved to the next practical thing, whatever it was. Silas followed her into the kitchen and stood there while she put the kettle on. "Good catch," he said. She shook her head, not dismissing it, dismissing something else. "Voss saw him twice," she said. "Twice. A wound like that, in a child presenting with prolonged fever." She stopped. Set the kettle harder than necessary on the hook. He was not looking. He decided what it was and stopped looking. "I know." "A child," she said. And it came out with an edge, the first real edge he'd heard from her, the thing underneath the careful steadiness. "He is 7 years old, and he has been sick for 6 days because a man with 30 years of practice couldn't be bothered to check under his shirt." Silas didn't say anything. She didn't need him to say anything. She needed to say that. "I'm sorry," she said after a moment. "You don't need—" "Don't apologize," he said. "You've earned that." She looked at him. The edge receded, not replaced by calm exactly, but by something more complex. The specific expression of someone who is tired of being professional about things that deserve anger and has been given unexpected permission to feel that for a moment. "Thank you," she said. Quiet. "Don't thank me either," he said. "Just—" He looked for what he wanted to say. "You were right in there. Everything you did. You know that." "I know," she said. "It's easier when there's someone in the room who knows it too." The kettle began to steam. She made enough tea for everyone and carried it out, and the Greer family sat in the main room with their recovering son between them and the kind of exhausted relief that doesn't yet fully believe itself. And Margaret sat at the table doing records, and Silas sat near the door because that was where he always sat. Old habit, clean sight lines, and the house held all of them. Later, after the Greers had settled and Margaret had gone to bed, and Thomas was sleeping the deep sleep of a body beginning to fight back with something to fight back with, Eliza sat at the kitchen table alone. Silas came downstairs for water and found her there. Not reading, not writing, just sitting with her tea gone cold in front of her and her hands flat on the table. He sat across from her without asking. She didn't say anything, which was its own kind of asking. "You all right?" he said. "Yes." A pause. "Mostly." A pause. "He's going to be fine. I'm sure of it." "I know. It's just—" She looked at her hands. "Every time something like this comes to my door, I think, how many others went to Voss and didn't come here? How many Thomases are there that I don't know about because they never found the mountain road?" Silas didn't have an answer to that, because there wasn't one, because it was the kind of question that didn't resolve, just sat in you and asked to be carried. "That's not something you can fix from up here," he said. "No," she said. "I know. But you fixed this one." She looked at him across the table. Her face in the lamplight was tired and honest, the particular honesty of late nights when the performance has run out. "Yes," she said. "I fixed this one." They sat for a while in the quiet of the kitchen, and it was the same kind of quiet he'd felt that first morning at breakfast. Full, present, expecting something true from him, but less unfamiliar now, less threatening. He'd gotten used to the shape of it, the way you get used to a room until it becomes the room you think of when someone says the word home. He was thinking about that when she said, "What was her name? Your wife?" He looked up. "Claire." What was she like? Nobody asked him that. Not anymore. 8 years in, people had stopped asking, which he'd told himself was fine because talking about her made things harder, and he had work to do. He told himself that enough times that he'd almost believed it. "She was funny," he said. "Genuinely funny, not in the way that you can describe, just her timing, the way she said things." He paused. "She was also the most stubborn person I've ever known, and I say that as someone who is aware that I am extremely stubborn. She had a way of just deciding something, and then it was decided, and reality had better catch up." Eliza almost smiled. "Was that what decided you? The marriage?" "She decided we were getting married," he said. "I spent a month thinking it was my idea." A pause, and something that was almost a laugh, or what his version of a laugh looked like when it came from somewhere real. "I found out later from her mother. Claire had decided within 2 weeks of meeting me. She just let me work up to it at my own pace." "She sounds practical," Eliza said. "She was," he said. "She was the most practical person I've ever—" He stopped. He'd been about to say most practical person I've ever known. Had been, until approximately the last 2 weeks. He didn't say that, but something in his expression must have arrived at the edge of it, because Eliza looked at him with the quiet alertness of a woman who has noticed something she wasn't expecting and is filing it carefully away. "I'm glad she had you," Eliza said finally, "and that you had her. Simple. True. No performance around it." "Me too," he said. They went to bed late, both of them, the house settling around them. Thomas's breathing was audible from the back room, steady, slightly ragged still, but steady. Clara was asleep in the chair beside him. Ray had finally stopped standing in corners and sat on the pallet and was probably asleep by now too. Silas lay in the dark of the spare room and thought, with a clarity that came from being very tired and thus past the usual defenses, that he had not felt this, whatever this was, this particular quality of being somewhere that had shape and weight and expected something real from him in 8 years, maybe longer. Maybe, if he was honest with himself in the particular way that dark rooms encouraged, maybe longer than Claire because Claire had been the one who made the shape, and when she'd left, so had it. Until, apparently now. I was aware this was complicated. He was aware that complicated was an understatement. I was a man with cracked ribs and a horse that wasn't quite healed and a job waiting for him 12 miles away with a dangerous man at large in his territory. And the woman in the next room down the hall had her own life built specifically and carefully without him in it, and none of this made simple sense. But the complicated thing and the true thing were sometimes the same thing. He'd known that for a while without liking it. He slept. Thomas's fever broke at some point in the early morning. Eliza told him at breakfast with the same quality she'd used to say thunder had taken weight on his leg clean. Not quite a smile, but something close enough that you could feel the warmth of it. The genuine relief behind the professional composure. Ray Greer shook Silas's hand in the yard when they were getting ready to go. They couldn't stay, had animals at home that needed them, would come back in 2 days to check on Thomas. And Ray held the handshake longer than handshakes usually go, which was the only way some men knew how to say something they didn't have language for. Silas held it equally long, which was the only way he knew how to receive it. Clara came out last, having kissed her son's forehead 17 times by Silas's count. She stopped in front of Eliza. "How much do we owe you?" she said. "Nothing yet," Eliza said. "Wait until he's fully recovered. Whatever you can manage then." Clara looked at her for a long moment. "The doctor in Mill Haven charged us for both visits," she said, "before Thomas got worse." Eliza's face didn't change. "I know," she said. "That's his business. This is mine." Clara nodded. She put her hand briefly on Eliza's arm, just briefly, not making a production of it, and then got up in the wagon. Silas watched them go. "She's going to tell people," he said. I know, Eliza said. More will come. I know. She was quiet for a moment. That's... Yes, I know. He looked at her profile. She was watching the wagon until it turned the bend and disappeared, and something in her face was complicated in ways he didn't try to read all at once. Not fear, not quite. Something that had decided to be something other than fear, and was working on it. You're not hiding up here, he said. You told me that. No, she said. I'm not. Then more people coming is not a problem. It's not a problem, she said. It's just... She stopped, started again. For 3 years it's been manageable, controlled. I know who comes, I know what they need, I have enough of everything. More is... She paused. More is more. You'll manage it, he said. She turned to look at him, slightly surprised. You managed it in Millhaven when you had nothing, he said. You managed building this with 2 people and no help. You managed last night. He held her gaze. More is just more. You'll figure it out. She looked at him for a moment, and it was the look from the barn, 1 beat longer than she probably meant. And then she looked back at the empty trail. You sound very certain, she said. I am very certain. She made a sound that was the closest thing to a laugh she'd offered him yet. Not quite there, but in the neighborhood. You've known me 2 weeks. Long enough, he said. She shook her head, but something had shifted in the set of her shoulders, some particular tension releasing. She turned and went back inside, and he stood in the yard a moment longer, looking at the trail where the wagon had gone, and then up at the mountains, and then back at the house. Long enough, he'd said. He meant it. He was increasingly sure he meant it, and increasingly unsure what to do with that sureness. And these 2 facts were coexisting inside him with the particular uncomfortable intimacy of things that were about to become impossible to ignore. He went in. Margaret handed him coffee. Eliza was already at the table with her journals, writing up Thomas's case with the same careful precision she brought to all of them. He sat down. She wrote. Margaret moved around the kitchen. Thomas slept in the back room, his color good and his breathing even, his body reclaiming itself from the wrong that had been done to it. Silas drank his coffee and watched Eliza write and thought about a man named Voss who had never bothered to look under a child's shirt. He thought about Frank Alderman. He thought about the specific architecture of a reputation that protects itself by consuming other people's work and other people's worth. He thought, that man is still out there, still practicing, still sending people up a mountain road when it's too late. He thought, not forever. He didn't say it, not yet, but he thought it with the particular focused cold of a man who has spent 11 years being very patient about the things that matter most. The 3rd night after the Greers came, 2 more families arrived within an hour of each other, both of them with sick children, and both of them having come from Millhaven with Voss's medicines that hadn't worked. The second family had heard about the first family the way news travels in frontier territory, fast, person to person, ahead of any official word. Eliza handled both cases. Silas and Margaret ran logistics, boiling water, heating the barn for additional space, managing the family's horses, keeping anxious fathers occupied with tasks so they weren't in Eliza's way. It was 3 in the morning before everything was settled, and Eliza came and sat on the barn step in the cold air, with her head tipped back and her eyes closed, and just breathed for a while. Silas sat beside her. Not close, just beside. How do you do that? He said. Hold all of it and still function. Same way you do, she said, eyes still closed. You just do. And then afterward you sit on a step in the cold and your hands shake a little where no one can see them. He looked at her hands, resting on her knees. They were completely still. They're not shaking, he said. They were, she said. Give me a minute. He gave her the minute. Silas, she said, still not opening her eyes. Yeah. You said you'd need a week to get better at chess. He looked at her. She still hadn't opened her eyes. Yeah. You've been here 2 weeks and a few days. A pause. I have, he said. Thunder is better. He is, Silas said. The cold air sat around them. Somewhere in the barn behind them a horse shifted. Not Thunder, one of the Greers' animals. The mountains were doing what they always did, enormous and patient and entirely uninvested in the small matters of human beings, sitting on barn steps at 3 in the morning in the dark. "I made a joke," she said, "the first week, when you said you'd leave when thunder was better." She opened her eyes and looked at him, and it was the most direct she'd looked at him yet, which was saying something because she'd been pretty direct all along. "I said I hoped he healed slowly." "I remember," he said. "I wasn't entirely joking," she said. The night held very still. He looked at her for a long moment, at this woman who had built something real out of wreckage, who had written the true version of a grief that had 3 drafts before it, who held 7-year-old boys still with steady hands at midnight, and then sat on steps and let herself shake where no one could see. "I know," he said. She held his gaze, and the careful measuring expression she wore was still there. But something behind it had shifted, the door a little more open than it had been, further than it had been any time before. "I don't know what you're thinking about doing," she said. "About staying or going or... I'm not asking you to decide anything. I just wanted you to know it wasn't entirely a joke." "I know," he said again. "Okay." She looked back at the mountains, settled herself slightly. "Okay." They sat on the step for a while longer, close enough that their shoulders were almost touching in the cold, not quite touching, the almost of it its own particular statement. Then she stood up and said she needed to check on the second child once more before she could sleep, and went inside. Silas sat there alone in the dark for a few more minutes, with the mountains and the cold air and the full knowledge that he was a man who had arrived at a crossroads without seeing the road bend. He thought about the letter waiting for him in Caldwell. He thought about Dutch Cutter and Colt and his badge, and 11 years of motion that had started as grief and become identity. And he thought about 2 weeks and a few days, which had been longer and shorter than any time he could remember, and a woman who had just told him, quietly and carefully, and with every door still technically open, that she had meant more than she'd said. He was going to have to decide something, soon. He made his decision in stages, the way most real decisions get made. Not in one clean moment of clarity, but in pieces, each one arriving quietly and taking up residence until the whole shape of it became impossible to ignore. The first piece arrived the morning after the barn step conversation, when he woke up and lay in the spare room listening to the sounds of the house coming alive. The particular creak of Eliza's step on the 3rd stair, the low rhythm of Margaret starting the stove, a child's voice from the back room that meant Thomas was awake and talking, which meant Thomas was going to be fine, and realized that he had memorized the sound of this house the way he had memorized, over 11 years, the sound of every place he'd needed to move through carefully. The difference was that he'd memorized those places to navigate them safely. He'd memorized this one because he didn't want to forget it. The second piece arrived 2 days later when Colt sent another letter. This one was longer. Colt had done what Silas told him, set the perimeter, contacted Henderson County, stayed back, and it had worked. Cutter had been spotted and then lost again near the southern ridge. But 2 Henderson deputies were now actively tracking him, and Colt was coordinating from Caldwell. He didn't need Silas to come back yet. He said so plainly, in the slightly too careful way of a young man trying to communicate that he was managing without making it sound like he was saying his boss wasn't needed. Silas read the letter twice. The professional part of him assessed it clearly. Colt was doing well. The situation was contained, not resolved, but contained. Another week would not break anything that wasn't already cracked. He wrote back. Told Colt he was doing the right things. Told him to keep the Henderson line open and not to move on Cutter without backup regardless of what it looked like from the ground. Told him the horse needed another week minimum. He did not examine too closely the fact that the horse probably needed 5 more days, not 7, and he'd written a week. The third piece, the one that settled everything, arrived on a Tuesday in the form of Dr. Harlan Voss. Silas didn't know it was going to happen. Nobody did. The man just appeared at the end of the ranch road in the late morning, in a buggy that looked too clean for mountain roads, with the particular bearing of someone who has decided they are entitled to go wherever they choose and expects the world to rearrange itself accordingly. Silas was in the yard splitting wood. His ribs had healed enough for careful, controlled work, and Margaret had identified that this was the next most useful thing, when he heard the buggy and looked up. He took in the man on the seat, well-dressed, somewhere in his 60s, white hair, the kind of face that had learned to arrange itself in permanent authority. A medical bag on the seat beside him. He kept splitting wood. The buggy stopped in the yard. The man got down with the deliberate ease of someone who has never had to hurry because things wait for him. "I'm looking for the woman who calls herself a healer up here," the man said. Not an introduction, not a greeting. Silas set the axe head down. "You found the ranch," he said. "What's your business?" The man looked at him with the specific calibration of a person determining how much respect the situation required. He appeared to decide, not much. "My business is my own," he said. "Is she here?" "Your name," Silas said. Still easy, still holding the axe handle loosely. A pause. The man reassembled his expression into something that was probably meant to be patient. "Dr. Harlan Voss. I practice in Mill Haven. I've had patients come to me reporting they were treated up here for conditions I had already assessed, and I'm here to discuss the situation." The cold thing in Silas's chest moved. It moved slowly and completely, the way cold things do when they've been waiting long enough. "You'll want to talk to Miss Rowan," he said. "She's inside." He did not go in with Voss immediately. He let the man walk to the door, let him knock, let Eliza open it, and have the full force of that moment on her own terms, because she was not a woman who needed to be protected from things, and because the worst thing he could do right now was rush in before she'd had a chance to face it herself. He stood in the yard and listened, not to the words, the walls were too thick, but to the tone. Voss's voice, loud and comfortable with its own authority. Eliza's voice, lower, not retreating. He gave it 3 minutes. Then he went in. The kitchen. Voss had not been invited to sit and had not sat, which meant Eliza had controlled that much from the beginning. He was standing in the middle of the room with his hat in his hands. Not humble, just not wearing it inside. Some relic of manners that coexisted with his complete lack of them. And he was talking with the smooth fluency of a man who had given this particular speech before. "Not a matter of questioning your competence in basic treatment," Voss was saying. "I understand that people in remote areas sometimes rely on local remedies, and I have no objection to that in appropriate circumstances. The difficulty is when patients come to me having been told that my diagnosis was incorrect, and having been given treatments that contradict my own, which creates confusion and undermines the integrity of proper medical care in this territory." "Thomas Greer," Eliza said. A pause. "I beg your pardon?" "Thomas Greer, 7 years old. You saw him twice for a prolonged fever. You prescribed for the fever." Her voice was completely level. "He had an infected wound under his left ribs. You didn't find it." Something moved across Voss's face, not guilt. Nothing as clean as guilt. More like irritation at the emergence of a specific obstacle he'd hoped wouldn't come up directly. "A wound of that nature would have been found in a thorough physical examination," Eliza said, "which the notes his mother showed me indicated you performed." Silas stood in the doorway and said nothing. He watched. "Examinations are not infallible," Voss said, reassembling his composure. "Medicine involves judgment calls, and no physician can guarantee—" "I'm not talking about guarantees," Eliza said. "I'm talking about a 7-year-old boy who came to me gray with fever after 6 days because the wound was missed. I found it in the first examination." She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. "I'm telling you what I found because you should know. If there are others you've seen with similar presentations—" "I think," Voss said, and the warmth had gone out of his voice entirely now, "that you are in a precarious enough position, given your history, to be very careful about making accusations against a licensed physician." The room went quiet. Silas felt the axe handle still in his right hand. He set it against the wall, quietly. "I didn't make an accusation," Eliza said. "I stated a finding." A pause. "And my history is exactly that. Mine." "Your history," Voss said, and there it was. The thing beneath the professional language, the thing that had always been there. "Includes a dead man and an inquiry that found you liable for contributing to that outcome. I was generous in the way I handled that situation. I could have been considerably less so." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Silas had heard in 2 weeks. He looked at Eliza. He watched her absorb that, watched her take the word generous into herself, watched her identify exactly what it meant, the absolute obscenity of that word from that man in this context. And he watched her decide what to do with it. She did not shake. She did not, as he might have in her position, say the 15 things he was currently composing in his head. She looked at Harlan Voss with the expression of a woman who has had 4 years to understand exactly who this man is and has come, finally, to the place past anger. "You should leave," she said. "Miss Rowan, I have patients here," she said. "You're in my home. You were not invited and you're not welcome to stay. Leave." Voss looked at her for a moment, and then, because he was fundamentally a man who only pushed where he calculated it was safe, he looked at Silas in the doorway. Silas looked back at him. He didn't touch his badge, he didn't put his hand near anything. He just looked at Harlan Voss with 11 years of patience and the specific expression of a man who is inviting you to make a choice you will regret. Voss picked up his hat. "This conversation isn't finished," he said. "Yes, it is," Silas said. First thing he'd said, easy and flat. "Have a safe ride back." Voss left. They listened to the buggy turn in the yard and move back down the road, and Silas stayed in the doorway until the sound of it faded, and then he turned to look at Eliza. She was standing in the middle of the kitchen with her hands at her sides, and her face doing something controlled and complicated. Margaret had appeared from somewhere, she always appeared when it mattered, and was standing near the table without saying anything, watching her daughter. "He said generous," Eliza said. Her voice was perfectly steady. "He said he was generous." "I know," Silas said. "He destroyed 4 years of my work and my name and my livelihood, and he said—" She stopped, started again. "He believes it. That's the part that—" She shook her head. "He actually believes he did me a favor by framing it the way he did instead of something worse. He believes he extended me a courtesy." Silas said nothing. "How does someone get there?" she said, and it was a real question, the kind that doesn't expect an answer. "How do you build that much distance between what you did and what you tell yourself you did?" "Slowly," Silas said. "Same way anyone does anything. Small steps, one at a time. You tell yourself a version that's slightly better than what happened, and then that becomes the baseline and you need a slightly better version of that. And after enough years, you're somewhere completely different from where you started and you don't remember the road." She looked at him. "You've seen that before." "I've arrested a lot of men who weren't criminals in their own minds," he said. "The ones who knew they were wrong were usually easier to deal with." She absorbed that. Then suddenly she sat down. Just sat, hard, in the kitchen chair, like the adrenaline had decided it was done and left without consulting her. Margaret put a cup of tea in front of her without being asked. Sat down across from her. "He's going to come back," Eliza said, "or do something. He didn't come all the way up here to leave it." "No," Silas agreed. "He didn't." "What does he want?" "He wants you to stop making him look bad by being good at what you do." Silas sat down at the table, the three of them. "Every family that comes up here instead of going to him is an accusation, from his perspective. Every child you fixed that he missed is evidence." He paused. "He came to warn you, which means he's worried enough to come in person. Which means," Margaret said, "that more people know about this place than he's comfortable with." "Yes," Silas said. Eliza looked at her tea. "He called it remote area remedies," she said. "Local remedies." "I know. I have more clinical hours than half the licensed physicians in this territory." She said it without heat, just a fact. "I know more than he does about 3/4 of what he treats. That's not arrogance. I have the records to demonstrate it. I can show outcomes. I can show—" She stopped. "I know," Silas said. "So what do I do?" "He has the license. He has the history. He has the court already decided in his favor once." She looked at Silas. "What would you do?" He thought about it, really thought about it, not the reflexive answer of law and procedure, but the actual tactical question of how you handle a man who has structural power and intends to use it. "You document everything," he said. "Everything you've done, every patient, every outcome, every case where someone came to you after going to him. You build the record so completely that when it becomes a question, and it will become a question, you have the answer in your hands already." He paused. "And you don't hide. You said you weren't hiding. Keep not hiding." "That's it?" she said. "That and you let me look into some things," he said. She looked at him carefully. "What things?" "Voss's practice, his record. The inquiry in Millhaven. There may be aspects of how that was handled that didn't get full scrutiny at the time." He held her gaze. "I'm a Marshal, Eliza. I have access to things that you don't. Not to—" I'm not going to chase the man down, that's not what I'm saying. But information, what's actually on record. Whether Frank Alderman's family ever formally challenged anything. Whether there have been other complaints. He paused. You said nobody did anything. That's what happened. It doesn't mean there's nothing to find. She was quiet for a long moment. If you find something, she said, and it doesn't lead anywhere, if it's the kind of thing that exists and still gets buried because of who he is, I need to know that you understand that is a real possibility. I understand that, he said. I've watched things get buried before. It doesn't always stay buried. She turned the teacup in her hands. All right, she said. Margaret, who had been listening to all of this with the expression of a woman running parallel calculations, said, More tea. She got up to make it. Silas stayed at the table with Eliza in the particular quiet that followed a hard conversation, the kind of quiet that has weight in it, not emptiness. He thought about Voss on the road back to Millhaven, in his too-clean buggy, already constructing the version of today's visit that put him in the best light. He thought about the word generous, and about Frank Alderman, and about Thomas Greer, who was in the back room right now doing the extraordinarily ordinary thing of recovering because someone had looked under his shirt. He thought about what it meant to let that go unanswered, what it cost, over years, to be the one who was right, and had no one with the standing to say so in the rooms where it mattered. He was not going to fix 4 years of damage. He wasn't going to promise that. But he was a man with access to rooms she couldn't enter, and he had been sitting in those rooms for 11 years collecting information on people who counted on the architecture of respectability to protect them. And he was, in the most practical and grounded possible sense, on her side. That was a thing. It was something. It wasn't nothing. Thunder was ready on the 18th day. Eliza confirmed it in the morning. A full examination, weight bearing on all 4 legs, the leg assessed from every angle with her hands and her trained eye. She did it while Silas watched, and at the end she stood back and looked at the horse, and then at him and said, He's ready. The leg is healed cleanly. He'll carry you on that ridge without issue. You're sure? I don't tell people things I'm not sure of. She said it without edge. Just fact. He stood with his hand on Thunder's neck and looked at the horse who had started all of this, whose bad step on a rain-soaked ridge on a night 3 weeks ago had changed the entire shape of things, and felt the particular strange gratitude you feel toward accidents that turn out to be the most important thing that ever happened to you. He saddled Thunder that afternoon, slowly, carefully, noting the horse's response at each step. Thunder stood easy under the tack, a little stiff, a little cautious, but sound. Silas led him out of the barn and into the yard and walked him in a slow circle, watching the left leg, watching the gait. Sound. Completely sound. He stood in the yard with the reins in his hand and looked at the mountains. The day was clear and cold, the kind of late-season clarity that comes before the first real snow, when everything is so sharp it almost hurts to look at. The ridge trail to Caldwell was visible from here if you knew where to look. A thin brown line on the mountain face, 12 miles of it, going back to the life that was waiting. He brought Thunder back to the barn and unsaddled him. He didn't examine that decision too closely. He went inside. Eliza was at her desk. She'd cleared a corner of the main room as a proper working space, with her records and journals organized on a shelf that Silas had helped move into position. And she looked up when he came in, looked at him. Looked at his hands, which did not have the saddlebags. She looked back at her journal. Coffee's still warm, she said. He poured a cup and sat at the table, and the afternoon went on around him. Margaret sewing near the window, Eliza writing, the house making its small particular sounds. 2 of the Greer family's neighboring ranchers had come in the morning for routine things, a deep cut on one man's hand, a child's ear infection on another. And the house had handled it the way the house handled everything, with focused competence and no drama, and now the afternoon had settled into something quieter. He sat with his coffee and thought about what he was doing. He was a man who had ridden this territory for 11 years. He had an obligation to that territory, to the people in it who expected his badge to mean something. He had an obligation to Colt, who was young and good and still needed a senior man's steadying presence. He had a dangerous man still moving through the territory who would eventually stop being careful and start being catastrophic. And when that happened, Silas needed to be in position to stop it. All of that was true. Also true, he had spent 18 days in this house and for the first time in 8 years had not felt like a man going through the motions of a life. Also true, the woman at the desk across the room had told him, on a barn step at 3 in the morning, that she had hoped his horse healed slowly, and he had told her he knew, and they had left it there, unresolved, which was where it still was. I was going to have to move at some point. The question was whether moving meant leaving. He thought about that for the rest of the afternoon. At supper, Margaret said, unprompted, the way she always said the things that most needed saying, "Ray Greer came by this morning while you were with Thunder." "I know," Silas said. "I saw the wagon. He brought payment for Thomas." She served the stew. "He also said something I thought you should know." She set down the pot. "He said that people in the valley have been talking about this place, about Eliza." She sat down. "He said there are 3 families who've been meaning to come up for various things, who've been waiting to see how the Greer situation resolved. And now that it's resolved the way it has, they're planning to come next week." "How many people is that?" Silas said. Ray thought, 8, 10. Margaret served her own bowl. "And that's just the ones he knows of." Silas looked at Eliza. She was looking at her stew, which meant she was thinking hard. "That's going to be a lot for 2 people," he said. "We've managed a lot before," Margaret said mildly. "Not regularly, not in volume." He paused. "You'd need more supplies, more space eventually. Someone to manage the road on bad weather days, keep families sorted, handle the logistics while you work." Eliza looked up. She looked at him with the expression he'd come to know. The careful one. The one where she was deciding how much of what she was thinking to say out loud. "You're describing a real practice," she said. "I'm describing what you already have," he said. "Just more of it." A pause. "Silas," she said, quiet. "What are you doing?" He looked at her directly. "I'm trying to figure out what's useful," he said. "What needs doing here that isn't getting done because there's only 2 of you." "That's not what I mean." He knew it wasn't what she meant. "I know," he said. Margaret ate her stew with the expression of a woman who has removed herself from a conversation she is absolutely present for. "Thunder's ready," Eliza said. Not accusing, just placing the fact between them. "He is." "So you could leave tomorrow." "I could." "But you unsaddled him this afternoon." He looked at her across the table. "I did." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the wind had picked up. The first real suggestion of the season turning, the cold getting purposeful. "I'm not asking you to stay," she said, very carefully. "I want to be clear about that. I'm not. This place isn't that. I don't want you to feel." "Eliza." She stopped. "I know you're not asking," he said. "That's not what's happening here." She held his gaze. "What is happening?" she said. He thought about how to say it. He was not a man who was good with this, not with the direct naming of things that were still forming, still uncertain. He was better at action than declaration, always had been. But she was a woman who had been misled by implication before, who had learned to document because silence could be arranged into lies, and she deserved something more than implication. "I have been in motion for 8 years, he said, moving because it was easier than stopping, because stopping meant sitting in what I'd lost, and I didn't think I could do that." He picked up his coffee, set it back down. "I came off that mountain 3 weeks ago because my horse put a foot wrong and I had no other option. And I've been sitting still ever since, and it turns out—" He paused. "It turns out stopping was not what I was afraid it would be." She was very still across the table. "I have a job to get back to," he said. "That's real. I'm not pretending that away. Colt is good, but he needs me there, and Dutch Cutter needs to be dealt with. And there are people in that territory who've counted on that badge for 11 years. He looked at her. "But there's a difference between going back to a job and going back to a life. And I've been confusing those 2 things for a while." The wind moved against the house. Margaret's spoon clinked very quietly against her bowl. "What are you saying?" Eliza said. "I'm saying I'd like to come back," he said. "When the Cutter situation is handled, and I can leave Colt in a stable position. I'd like to come back here, and—" He stopped, looked at the table, then back at her. "I'd like to see where this goes, if that's something you want." The quiet that followed was the longest he'd experienced in 3 weeks of long silences. He watched her face move through things. She was not a woman who responded to things quickly. She considered. She turned it over. She checked it from different angles the way she checked a diagnosis. He sat with it and waited,
because she'd earned whatever time she needed. "I live on a mountain," she said finally. "I know. I'm going to have more patients than I can manage, soon, and I don't—" She paused. "I'm not easy. I don't let things go easily, and I say what I think, and I have opinions about medicine that most people find exhausting." "I've noticed," he said. "And you've been here 3 weeks," she said. "That's not—" "I know how long I've been here. You might come back and find out I'm—" "Eliza." He waited until she stopped. "I've spent 11 years reading people for a living. It's not 3 weeks of knowing you. It's—" He thought about how to say it. "It's every morning in the barn and the journals and the way you teach and what you did for Thomas and the chess and the way you make your mother laugh and the barn step and the fact that you write things 3 times until you find the true version." He looked at her steadily. "I know enough." She looked at him for a long time. "You'd come back," she said. Not a question exactly, testing the weight of it. "Yes. And in the meantime—" "In the meantime, I write letters," he said. "And you write letters if you want to. And I handle what needs handling and come back when I can, and we figure out what this is while it's actually in front of us, instead of sitting here trying to predict it." Something shifted in her face. The door, the one she'd been opening in increments for 3 weeks, opened a little further. "I'm not good at letters," she said. "I am," he said. "I'll carry the correspondence until you improve." She looked at him. And then, for the first time fully, without the usual careful restraint, she smiled. It was not a small thing. It was real and wide and slightly surprised at itself, and it changed her face into something he stored away immediately and completely. "That's presumptuous," she said. "Probably," he agreed. Margaret stood up, collected her bowl, and walked to the kitchen without a word, and Silas heard her over there humming. The low hum she stopped when she thought people could hear it. She did not stop tonight. They stayed at the table for a while, he and Eliza, not saying very much, not needing to. The decision had been made, not dramatically, not perfectly, with all its complications still intact and nothing resolved except the direction. And that was enough for tonight. He left the next morning. He thought there might be something to manage around the leaving, some awkwardness, some too formal goodbye that didn't fit what 3 weeks had become. There wasn't. Margaret handed him a wrapped bundle of food for the ride, pressed it into his hands with the brevity of a woman who has said what she needed to say in other ways. He thanked her and meant it in the complete way. Eliza walked with him to the end of the yard where the ranch road began. Thunder moved easy underneath him, the leg carrying cleanly, and Silas could feel the difference from 3 weeks ago. The horse was rested and healed and ready in a way that felt almost like eagerness. He looked down at her from the saddle. "I'll write when I reach Caldwell," he said. "I'll write back," she said. "Eventually." Work on the eventually. She looked up at him with that expression, measuring, direct, the door open. "Be careful on the ridge," she said. "The shale's still loose from the rain." "I know the ridge." "You fell off the ridge." Thunder fell. I fell with him. There's a distinction. She almost smiled. Almost. "Go do your job, Marshal." He held her gaze for a moment. "I'll come back," he said. "I know," she said. He turned Thunder north and rode. He did not look back for the first 100 yards because he was a practical man, and the road needed attention. When he did look back, she was still standing at the end of the yard watching him go, and she raised one hand briefly when she saw him turn, and then she went back to the house. He faced forward and rode. The ridge was exactly as she'd said, loose shale, treacherous in the places where the rain had gotten under it. He took it slow, which was not in his nature but was in his judgment, and Thunder picked his way through it with the careful attention of an animal who had recently learned what careless footing cost. They came through it without incident and hit the lower trail where the going got easier, and Silas let Thunder find his own pace. The mountains opened up around him, and Caldwell was ahead somewhere in the distance, and the Cutter situation, and Colt, and the cases on his desk, and all of it was real and waiting. He went toward it without the usual sensation of going toward the only thing there was, that flatness, that motion for motion's sake that had been his life for 8 years. There was something behind him now, something that had weight and warmth and expected the true version of things, something he was going to come back to. He rode. Around midday he stopped at a creek to water Thunder, and stood there in the cold light with the horse drinking, and thought about Eliza's face when she'd finally smiled,
and about Margaret's humming, and about a medical journal with 3 drafts before the true one, and about a chessboard and a barn step, and a 7-year-old boy whose color had come back because someone had bothered to look. He thought about Harlan Voss on the road back to Millhaven, settling into his own comfortable version of things. He thought about what he'd told Eliza, not forever. He had access to rooms she couldn't enter. He had 11 years of knowing how information moved and where records went and who had the authority to ask questions in the places that mattered. He hadn't promised to fix anything. He knew better than to promise that. But he was going to look. Carefully, thoroughly, with the patience of a man who had spent 11 years learning how to build a case that would hold. He watered his horse and remounted and rode toward Caldwell, and the afternoon light was sharp and clean on the mountains, and the territory that had been his for 11 years spread out around him familiar and demanding. He was glad to be heading back to it. He was also, for the first time in 8 years, glad there was somewhere else to come back to. That night he made camp at the halfway point. He'd ridden slower than usual, both for thunder's sake and because the shale section had cost him time, and built a small fire and ate from the bundle Margaret had packed, which turned out to include cornbread that she had clearly made that morning before he was up, which meant she'd known he was leaving before he'd told anyone, which did not surprise him in the least. He sat with the fire and the mountains at dark around him and thought about what came next. The Cutter situation, first, then the Voss records, then the long work of figuring out how to divide a life between a badge and a mountain ranch in a way that was honest to both. It was not a simple problem. It was, in fact, a considerably complicated one. But he was not, as he'd thought for a while, a man who only wanted simple things. He'd wanted simple because it hurt less. He'd wanted motion because stopping was grief. He'd stopped. For 18 days he'd stopped, and what he'd found was not grief. Or not only grief. What he'd found was that the life in him was still there, still interested, still capable of the particular kind of warmth that comes from sitting at a table where something true is expected. He put out the fire and slept on the cold ground with thunder picketed nearby, and if he dreamed he didn't remember it. And in the morning he rose before light and saddled up and pointed himself toward Caldwell. He had work to do. He intended to do it well, and quickly, and then to write the letter he'd promised, and after that he would take it one thing at a time, which was all any of it required. Thunder moved easy under him, the bad leg carrying clean, the mountain air cold and clarifying in the way of things that are honest about what they are. 12 miles to Caldwell, and then, when it was done, 12 miles back. Caldwell looked smaller than he remembered. That was the first thing Silas noticed when he rode in off the lower trail on a Thursday morning with the season's first real cold riding behind him. The town hadn't changed. Same main street, same false front buildings, same mud ruts from the freight wagons that never fully dried before the next rain turned them fresh again. The barber shop. The feed store. The jail with its particular leaning quality, like it was tired of standing up straight and had decided to compromise. Nothing had moved. Nothing was different. He was different. That was the thing. He'd ridden 12 miles back to a life and discovered that a life, like a coat you've worn so long you've stopped feeling it, looks different when you've taken it off for a while. Not worse, just accurately. You see its actual shape instead of the shape your body had memorized. Colt was at the jail when Silas came in, and to his credit, the young deputy managed to look relieved and professionally composed at the same time, which showed growth. He'd filled out in 3 weeks, not physically, but in the way he occupied the room. Less checking the corners, more settled in the center. "Marshal," he said, "good to have you back." "Tell me about Cutter," Silas said. Colt told him. He'd been tracking Cutter's movements for 2 weeks with the Henderson deputies, building a picture of the man's pattern, where he struck, how far he traveled after, where he went to ground. Cutter was clever, but he was also, as Silas had suspected, not quite as disorganized as he appeared. He had a route. He had timing. I was working the territory systematically, which meant he could be anticipated if you understood the system. "He'll move again within the week," Colt said. "Maybe sooner. The weather's been keeping him still, but there's a clear stretch coming." "Where?" Colt had a map. He pointed. Silas looked at it for a long time. The route Colt had traced was good, clean, logical, based on solid observation. He found 2 adjustments and pointed them out and explained why. And Colt looked at the map and then at him and nodded slowly. The nod of someone who can see it once it's been shown. North Fork instead of the main, Colt said. Cutter knows the main ford is watched. He's been moving through territory for 6 weeks without getting caught. He's not using the obvious roads. Silas straightened. We set up at the North Fork and we wait. We don't move until he commits. Henderson deputies? 2, at the south cutoff, in case he doubles back. Silas looked at the map one more time. We need to move in 4 days, that's the window. Colt nodded. Then, after a moment, with the careful casualness of a man asking something he's been holding, the horse all right? Good as new, Silas said. Better, maybe. And the ranch up there, was it? Colt stopped, recalibrated. Were they able to help him? Silas looked at his deputy. Yes, he said. They were. He did not elaborate. Colt, to his considerable credit, did not push. The letter he'd promised arrived before his did. He came in from checking the horses on the second evening to find an envelope on his desk, brought down with a supply rider, apparently, because he'd sent his own letter up with the same rider the day before, and Eliza had responded immediately, which meant she'd written it shortly after he left. He stood there in the office and looked at the envelope for a moment before he opened it. Her handwriting. Small, precise, the same as in the journals. The letter itself was 2 pages. The first page was almost entirely clinical. She'd seen 4 patients since he left, 2 of whom were follow-ups from earlier cases. One new presentation she described in the particular technical detail that was how her brain organized things when given free rein. Thomas Greer was fully recovered. His mother Clara had sent a jar of preserved plums with her thanks, which Eliza reported was the nicest payment she'd received all year, slightly beating a hand-stitched quilt from the previous February. He read all of it with the attention he'd have given a case file, because that was how she communicated, and he was learning the language. The second page was shorter. She wrote that the house was the same size it had been before he left, but was experiencing an inexplicable acoustic irregularity that made it sound emptier than the rooms warranted. She wrote that she had taken his advice about the documentation and had begun constructing a comprehensive record of outcomes organized by presenting condition and treatment, which would take time, but was already clarifying patterns she hadn't been tracking explicitly. She wrote that Margaret had beaten her at chess twice in the past 2 days, which she attributed entirely to distraction and not to any actual improvement in her mother's game. At the end, she wrote, "You said you'd carry the correspondence. I'm choosing to interpret that as meaning the quality bar for my contributions is low. This is me working within the constraint." He read that twice. He sat down and wrote back immediately, 4 pages, which was more than he'd written to anyone in years and which he did not examine too critically because the examination would make him self-conscious, and the letter was already good. He dealt with the Cutter situation on a Wednesday. It went the way well-planned things sometimes go. Not cleanly, not without complication, but correctly. Cutter came through the North Fork exactly where Colt's tracking had predicted, and Silas was there waiting with Colt on his right and the Henderson deputies covering the south. And Cutter saw it too late and made the decision some men make in those moments, which is to try for it anyway because standing down feels worse than the alternative. He tried for it. He was fast. Silas was faster, and he was also not alone, which had always been Cutter's specific problem. He operated in a world where everyone else was also alone, and he'd never properly accounted for the possibility of coordination. Colt took him down without injury to either party, which was the best possible outcome, and also, Silas noted, showed the instinct of someone who had been paying attention to how things were supposed to be done. Afterward, standing in the cold mud of the North Fork with Cutter cuffed and the horses settling and the Henderson deputies doing the paperwork that these things required, Colt looked at him with the expression of a young man who has done the thing he was afraid he wouldn't be able to do. "Nice work," Silas said. Colt nodded, looked at the ground, nodded again. "Couldn't have placed him without the 2 weeks of tracking," he said. "The tracking was—" He paused. "I understood the territory better after that, like I could see the whole shape of it." "That's what tracking does," Silas said. "It makes you learn the ground instead of just moving over it." He said it and then stood with it for a moment, because it was also true of other things. They rode Cutter back to Caldwell in the afternoon light, and Silas filed the paperwork himself because Colt had done the field work, and it was a fair division, and by evening it was done. A week's worth of loose ends, also done. He'd written to the territorial office, arranged transport for Cutter to the circuit court,
cleared 3 smaller cases that had backed up while he was on the mountain. He sat in the jail office at the end of it all and looked at his desk, which was clear for the first time in longer than he could remember, and thought, all right. Then he started digging into Harlan Voss. He hadn't talked about this to Colt. It wasn't Colt's business, and it wasn't officially his business either, except in the way that anything happening in his territory was his business, and except in the other way, the one that had nothing to do with jurisdiction and everything to do with a woman sitting at a table after a courtroom had emptied with nowhere left to go. He started with the official record of the Millhaven inquiry. He had access to territorial court records through the Marshal's office, one of the few genuine advantages of the position that didn't involve physical risk, and he spent 3 evenings reading everything that had been submitted, everything that had been entered, everything that had been formally decided. What he found was not a conspiracy. That would have been simpler. What he found was something harder to address and ultimately more damning, a proceeding that had been conducted correctly on its surface and corruptly in its architecture. The inquiry board had consisted of 3 men, a territorial magistrate, a civic representative from Millhaven, and a physician from the county seat who had trained under Voss 20 years prior. That last fact was in the record. No one had objected to it. Apparently no one had found it worth flagging. Eliza's case notes, the ones she'd said were not admitted as relevant, appeared in the record as having been reviewed and found insufficient to alter the established timeline of treatment. That was the language. He read it 4 times. It did not say the notes were wrong. It said they were insufficient. It was the kind of language that meant something specific to people who knew how to read it and nothing to anyone else. Frank Alderman's family had not filed a formal challenge. He'd expected that. People who are grieving and poor and up against the weight of an established man's reputation don't usually know they can, and even when they know, they often can't afford to find out what happens when they try. But there was something else. 2 years after the Millhaven inquiry, a family in a different part of the territory had filed a complaint against Voss for treatment they believed had caused harm to their elderly mother. The complaint had been reviewed by the Territorial Medical Board. It had been dismissed on procedural grounds, filed outside the acceptable window, though only barely. But the dismissal was on record, which meant the complaint was on record, which meant the pattern was beginning to exist in an official place, even if it hadn't yet been officially called a pattern. He wrote to the Territorial Medical Board directly. He identified himself, explained that he was conducting a routine inquiry into a practitioner working in his territory following multiple reports from patients, and requested any records of complaints or proceedings related to Dr. Harlan Voss of Millhaven. He wrote it in the careful, measured language of an official request that had legal standing and was difficult to ignore. Then he wrote to Frank Alderman's oldest daughter. He'd found her name in the inquiry record, Ruth Alderman, now Ruth Connolly, living outside of Helena. He wrote to her carefully, explaining who he was, explaining that he was looking into the events surrounding her father's death, and asking if she would be willing to correspond with him about what her family had experienced. He sent both letters with the Territorial Post on a Friday morning. He wrote to Eliza the same day. He told her what he'd found in the record, factually and completely, because she deserved the full picture and not the managed version. He told her about the second complaint. He told her about the inquiry board composition and the language used for her notes. He told her it wasn't fixed yet and might not be fixable in the way that felt like justice, but that it was not buried as deeply as she'd believed, and that he intended to keep looking. He ended the letter the way he'd been ending letters to her, not with anything that would have embarrassed either of them on a public document, but with something true, which was that he thought about the mountain more than was professionally warranted, and that Thunder was in excellent condition and ready for the return trip whenever the return trip was justified. Her response came back in 5 days, which was faster than her first letter, which he noted. She wrote, received 3 new families that week, one of which had traveled from 2 days' distance based on what they'd heard from the Greers. She had treated a case of blood poisoning in a rancher that she was fairly confident would have resulted in amputation, or worse, if left to Millhaven's care. She had also, she wrote, drafted a formal record of outcomes from the past 3 years that now ran to 47 pages and covered 212 individual patient interactions. She was going to continue building it. She thought he should know. On the matter of the Territorial Medical Board, she wrote, "If you find what I think you might find, I want to know immediately. Not eventually. Immediately."
I have waited long enough to be angry in the right direction." He smiled at that, alone in his office, at 9 in the evening, with a cold stove and a clear desk, and nowhere he needed to be. He wrote back, "Immediately. I promise." The reply from Ruth Connolly arrived 3 weeks later. He read it standing at the postal office because he hadn't wanted to wait until he got back to the jail. She was 34. She'd been 22 when her father died. She wrote in the plain, direct voice of a woman who had spent 12 years deciding what she thought about something and had arrived somewhere clear. She wrote that she had not known about Eliza Rowan until Silas's letter. She had not known that another healer had seen her father, had made a different assessment, had tried to redirect his treatment. She had not known because no one had told her, and the inquiry had not told her, because the inquiry had been structured around what Voss had done and not around what might have been done differently. She wrote that she would like to speak to Eliza. She asked if Silas could arrange it. He read the letter twice, standing in the cold outside the postal office, and then he walked directly to the telegraph office and sent a wire to the Territorial Medical Board following up on his formal request, and then he went back to the jail and sat down and wrote 2 letters, one to Ruth Connolly and one to Eliza. And in both of them he said, "We're not done yet, but we're further along." He rode back up the mountain on the first clear Saturday in November. He hadn't announced it in advance. Not deliberately, he'd just written that he was planning to come when the situation in Caldwell was stable enough to leave. And by the time he'd sent that letter, the situation had become stable, and he'd saddled up before sending a follow-up, which meant he arrived without formal notice, which was probably the truer version of how he'd wanted to do it anyway. The ranch looked different in November light. The garden was put to bed, the summer's growth cleared and turned under, the bare soil dark against the dry grass. The barn looked solid. He'd worked on parts of it in those 3 weeks, the kind of work that you only see the quality of in later seasons when the weather tests it. It held. He felt something proprietary about that, which was probably unjustified and which he felt anyway. Margaret was in the yard when he came around the bend, doing something practical with a fence post that looked like it had shifted in the recent frost. She looked up, looked at him, looked at his saddlebags, which were considerably more full than they'd been when he left, because he'd been accumulating things over the past weeks with no fully conscious intention that he'd been recognizing as intention. "She's in the barn," Margaret said. He dismounted, handed Thunder's reins to Margaret, and went. Eliza was in the barn. She was at the workbench doing something with dried herbs that required attention, and she didn't look up when the barn door opened because she was in the middle of something, and she finished the thing she was in the middle of before she did anything else. That was exactly how he'd expected it, and he found it, not charming, that was the wrong word. He found it right, consistent, like she was the same person regardless of whether he was watching, which he already knew and needed no confirmation of, but which was good to see again. She tied off the bundle, set it down, turned. She looked at him for a moment with the expression he'd missed more than he'd allowed himself to think about. The direct, measuring, door-open look. And then something in her face that was not quite a smile and was warmer than a smile, something that was just the fact of being genuinely glad, without performance or management. "You didn't write that you were coming," she said. "I wrote that I was planning to come when it was stable enough." "That's not the same as, it's close enough," he said. She looked at him. "It is," she agreed. He told her about Ruth Connolly that night after supper, when Margaret had gone up, and the two of them sat at the kitchen table where they'd played chess, and where Eliza had told him about Frank Alderman, and where all the important things seemed to happen, in this house that ran on truth. He gave her Ruth's letter. She read it carefully, twice, and when she put it down, her hands were flat on the table and her face was doing the controlled, complicated thing. "She didn't know," Eliza said. "No. All this time, the family. She spent 12 years not knowing that there was someone who saw what was actually happening." She looked at the letter. "That's—" She stopped. He waited. She must have thought it was just— She stopped again. She must have thought it was just something that happened. A doctor makes a call and a man dies, and that's medicine. That's the cost of it. Sometimes things go wrong. She shook her head slowly. She didn't know it didn't have to go wrong. "No," Silas said. "She didn't." Eliza was quiet for a long time. "I'd like to write to her," she said. "I know. I told her I'd arrange it." She looked up at him. "What do you think will happen? If she wants to, if there's any possibility of reopening, I don't know, he said. Honestly, the territory has a medical board that has now received an official inquiry from a marshal. The board has at least one prior complaint on file. We have Ruth Connolly, who has never formally challenged the outcome of the inquiry. We have your 47 pages of documented outcomes. He paused. I don't know what happens. It might be nothing. The board might find a way to let it sit. Voss has a lot of years and a lot of standing. But standing isn't permanent, he said, and people who have gotten away with things for a long time usually get careless. He came up here. He said what he said about being generous. He keeps practicing the way he practices. Eventually the pattern gets large enough that even the people invested in not seeing it can't look away. She looked at him steadily. You're not promising me anything. No, he said. I'm not. Good, she said. I have enough promises that didn't hold. I'd rather have a man who tells me the real version. He looked at her across the table. You have one of those. The door was open. She looked at him for a long moment, with everything that had accumulated over weeks of letters and weeks before that of barn mornings and chess games and mountain trails and barn steps. And then she said, I know. He stayed a week that time, then rode back, then came back again in 3 weeks. The pattern established itself the way patterns do when both people involved have stopped fighting the natural shape of things. Organically, practically, without dramatic declaration or false resolution of all the things that were still complicated. The Voss situation moves slowly, the way institutional things move, which is to say, with the patients testing incrementalism of a process that has no interest in anyone's personal timeline. The Territorial Medical Board acknowledged Silas's formal inquiry in December. They requested documentation. He sent it, his own official report, the copies of the complaint files he'd obtained through proper channels, and Eliza's 47 pages of outcomes, which he attached with the specific intention that the board should have to sit with 212 patient interactions before they found their response. Ruth Connolly wrote to Eliza. The letters went back and forth over the winter, and Silas read none of them because they were private, but he saw Eliza's face after she read each one, and what he saw was something that did not have a clean word, not healing, that was too tidy, not resolution, that was too final. More like two people who had each been carrying something alone, discovering that the other person had been carrying the same thing from the other side, and finding that this did not fix anything but made the carrying different. Voss came back to the mountain once more. In January. This time Silas was there. He'd come up the Friday before and hadn't gone back yet, and he was in the yard splitting wood. It had become specifically his task, which he'd noticed and not mentioned, when the buggy came up the road. Voss saw Silas and saw something in Silas's face that made him slow the buggy before he fully stopped it. Marshal, he said. Careful. Dr. Voss, Silas said. He set the axe down. You've been contacted by the Territorial Medical Board. It was not a question. He'd gotten confirmation of the contact from the board directly. Something moved through Voss's expression. Not fear. Not yet. But the first cousin of it. The beginning of the calculation of a man who is realizing that the architecture he's relied on is showing structural questions. That is a private matter between myself and the board, Voss said. The board's inquiry was initiated by my office, Silas said. That makes it my business. He looked at the man steadily. What you do in Mill Haven is between you and your license. What you do in this territory and what your patients do when they leave your care and come up this mountain is something I pay attention to. You have no authority to... I have authority to report what I observed to the Territorial Medical Board, Silas said, which I have done. And I have authority to maintain records of patient outcomes in my territory, which I'm doing. And I have authority to be standing in this yard when a man who has been formally questioned by the medical board comes up a mountain road to visit the healer who initiated that inquiry. He paused. I'm not arresting you. I'm not threatening you. I'm telling you what's true. Voss looked at him for a long moment, and then at the house, where Eliza had appeared in the doorway. And Silas knew the man was doing the calculation. The one where you assess whether what you came to do is still worth the cost of doing it, given what you now know about who's in the yard. I came to discuss a professional matter, Voss said. You came to warn her again, Silas said. She heard you the first time. We both did. Voss sat in the buggy for a moment longer, and Silas stood in the yard with the axe handle in his hand and said nothing more, because everything had been said, And sometimes the most effective thing is simply to be present and make the cost of proceeding visible. Voss turned the buggy around. They watched him go. Silas from the yard, Eliza from the doorway. And when the sound of it faded down the mountain road, Eliza came out and stood beside him and said nothing for a moment. "He looked smaller," she said. "He is smaller," Silas said. "He just doesn't know it yet." She looked at the road where the buggy had been. "Do you think the board will do anything?" "I think they'll do something," he said. "Not enough. Probably not justice in the full version of the word, but something." He paused. "And if they don't, I'll report again. And if the report goes nowhere, I'll look for what else there is to find. Because men like Voss don't stop doing what they do, which means they keep generating evidence." He looked at her. "I have time." She turned to look at him, and something in her face was very still and very certain, the way it went when she'd finished deciding something. "So do I," she said. "The Territorial Medical Board issued a formal censure of Dr. Harlan Voss in the spring. Not revocation. Silas had warned Eliza not to expect that, and he'd been right not to let her expect it. But a censure, entered into the official record, requiring annual review of his practice and mandatory documentation of any case resulting in patient death or significant deterioration. The language of the censure cited a pattern of incomplete physical examination leading to misdiagnosis in multiple documented cases. Not the full naming of the thing, not Frank Alderman by name, not Eliza Rowan's career by name, but the pattern, on the record, in permanent ink. Eliza read the official notice that Silas brought up from the territorial office on a Tuesday afternoon in April, standing in the kitchen where all the important things happened. She read it twice, set it down, put her hand flat on the table. Margaret, who had also read it, was at the stove not saying anything with the specific quality of a woman feeling something large. "It's not enough," Eliza said. "No," Silas said. "He should lose the license." "Yes." "Frank Alderman's family deserved—" "Yes," Silas said. "They did." She stood with her hand on the table and her face doing all of it, the grief and the anger and the specific exhaustion of being right about something for years, while the world organized itself around being wrong. He let it be there. He didn't try to resolve it or reframe it or find the angle that made it easier. After a moment, she said, "Ruth Connolly called it a step. In her last letter, she said, it's a step." "She's right," he said. "I know." Eliza took her hand off the table, straightened. "I know she's right." She looked at the notice. "I spent 4 years thinking there was nothing in the record, that he'd built himself something completely sealed." A pause. "There's something in the record now." "There is," he said, "and it will be there when the next thing happens. When he makes another mistake. It won't be the first complaint anymore." "No," Silas said. "It won't." She looked at him for a long moment. "You did that," she said. "We did that. Your documentation was what the board couldn't set aside. 212 patient interactions compared against his outcomes. They couldn't look away from the numbers. You put it in front of them. You built it." She looked at him with that expression, the open door, and said nothing for a moment, and then she went to the stove where the kettle was steaming and made coffee for 3 people and brought it to the table and sat down, and Margaret sat down, and Silas sat down, and they drank it in the kitchen on a Tuesday afternoon in April, with the mountains outside the window doing what they always did, and the notice on the table doing what it would have to be enough to do for now. He asked her to marry him on a Saturday in May. This was not as dramatically planned as it might sound. He had been working toward it in his own particular fashion for weeks, the way he worked toward all serious decisions, incrementally and practically, checking the structure of the thing from every angle before committing to it. He had talked to Margaret first, not to ask permission, but because Margaret was the other person whose life would be changed by it, and she deserved the conversation. Margaret had looked at him for a long moment and then said, "It took you long enough," and gone back to whatever she'd been doing, which he took as confirmation that he was not operating in a void. He asked Eliza in the barn. This was not a romantic choice so much as a practical one. It was where the important things seemed to happen between them, where there was no performance required, where they had first found each other honest. "I was checking on Thunder, who spent his days in the high pasture now and came back in at night, and Eliza was there for the same reason, and the evening light was coming through the high window the way it did in May, long and warm, and he just said it. "I'd like to marry you," he said, "if that's something you want." She looked at him. "Not if it isn't," he said. "But I wanted to ask instead of waiting until, I don't know. I've already spent enough time not asking for things I wanted." She was quiet for a moment, and he let her be quiet. Because she was a woman who finished things before she moved to the next thing, and this was the most important thing either of them had been asked to finish in years. "This is not a simple life," she said. "I want to be clear about that. People come at all hours. There are weeks when I barely sleep. It's going to get larger, not smaller, and I don't have any interest in making it smaller." She looked at him directly. "And you have a job that takes you down that mountain, and I need to know that both of those things are real to you at the same time, not just the one you're standing in at any given moment." "They're both real," he said. "They've been both real for months." "And you're certain?" "Eliza," he said, "I rode off that mountain 3 times and came back. I'm certain." She looked at him. The door was open, fully, completely, further than he'd ever seen it.
"Then, yes," she said, "it's something I want." They married in September, outdoors, in the yard of the ranch, because neither of them had a strong connection to any building in particular, and the yard had good light in the afternoon and was large enough for the people who came. And people came. More than Silas had expected and more than Eliza had let herself expect. Neighbors, ranchers, 3 families who'd had children treated on the mountain, Ray and Clara Greer with Thomas, who was running circles around the adults with the specific energy of a child who has recovered fully and intends to use that recovery to its maximum capacity. Ruth Connolly, who had ridden 2 days to be there and who sat next to Margaret and did not need to explain to anyone why she was there. It was not a perfect day. It rained in the morning. Someone's horse got into the garden and had to be extracted with significant effort, and several people's Sunday clothes. Silas said the wrong thing at the beginning of his vows. Not wrong as in untrue, wrong as in he lost his place because he'd written them down and then decided not to read them and had gone off script and then gotten ahead of himself. And Eliza waited with patient, almost smiling attention while he found his way back to what he meant to say, which he eventually did, and said it plainly without the text. What he said was, she was the truest person he knew, that he had spent a long time in motion and she had given him somewhere worth stopping, that he intended to be the kind of man she could rely on to do the hard thing, the honest thing, the necessary thing, and to come back to her when it was done. She said, looking at him across the yard with all of it in her face, the mountain and the journals and the barn step and the chessboard and the boy with the fever and the letter in her handwriting that said, "I'm choosing to interpret that as meaning the quality bar for my contributions is low." She said, "I believe you." And that's not a small thing, that I believe you. It was not a small thing. She was right. The ranch became something over the years that none of them had specifically planned. Not a plan executed, but a thing that grew because it was well-rooted and the conditions were honest. Margaret organized the records with the rigor of a woman who had decided this was her life's work and was right about that. Eliza saw everyone who came, turned no one away, built the documented outcome record past 300 patients, and then past 500. Silas divided his life between the badge and the mountain with the practicality that occasionally felt like too much, and occasionally felt like exactly right, and mostly felt like the normal difficulty of a life that contains more than one true thing. He used the badge on Voss's behalf without ever calling it that. When the medical board's annual review came around each year, he submitted his own observation report alongside Eliza's clinical documentation, and the weight of the two together was different from either alone, the law and the medicine, the official record and the patient outcomes, the thing you couldn't look away from, and the man who made sure you couldn't look away. 3 years after the censure, a second formal complaint against Voss was filed by a family that had lost an elderly woman in circumstances that bore uncomfortable resemblance to Frank Alderman's case. This time, the complaint was filed within the proper window. This time, the inquiry board did not include anyone who had trained under Voss. This time, when the inquiry was assembled, the existing record of the prior censure and the documented complaints and the pattern that had been named, even if not fully, was already there, already in the room, impossible to ignore. Voss's license was suspended pending investigation in November of that year. Silas brought the news up the mountain himself on a Thursday, arriving in the afternoon with the official notice in his coat.
He handed it to Eliza in the kitchen. She read it again, set it on the table. She didn't say anything for a long time. He waited. Frank Alderman, she said. Yes. It doesn't bring him back. No, Silas said. It doesn't. And Voss will argue it. He'll fight the suspension. He has money and he has the reputation and he has less of all of those things than he did 4 years ago, Silas said. And the inquiry has everything we've built since then. He paused. It's not over, but it's further than we've ever been. She put her hand flat on the notice, the same way she'd put her hand on the table the day of the censure, that gesture of making something real through touch. Ruth Connolly deserves to know first, she said. I already wrote to her, Silas said. She'll have the letter by the weekend. Eliza looked at him. The door, full open, the way it had been for years now, the way he'd stopped thinking about in terms of open and closed because it was simply how she looked at him. And underneath it, something that was not quite relief and not quite completion, but the nearest available thing. You thought of her before you even got here, she said. She's part of this, he said. She's been part of it since the beginning. She just didn't know it yet. Eliza nodded slowly. Then she stood up from the table and went to the stove and made coffee, because that was what she did when things needed settling into. And the afternoon light came through the kitchen window, the way it always did, long and warm, and Thunder was out in the high pasture doing what horses do when they are completely recovered and the grass is good. He had a scar on his left foreleg, barely visible now, a thin line of slightly different texture that you'd only find if you knew to look for it. Silas had found it once, running his hand along the leg in the barn, and had stood there with his hand on it for a moment, thinking about the night on the ridge, the wrong step, the dark and the rain, and the sound that had come out of the horse that he'd never fully been able to put down. He thought about what it had led to, the barn and Eliza in the doorway with her coat half buttoned and her medical journal in her hand. Margaret in the kitchen with coffee and a very particular expression. The chess games and the journals and the mountain trails and the barn step at 3 a.m. and all the rest of it, still accumulating, still alive, still the truest part of whatever his life had become. A wrong step on a wet mountain, a horse that fell, and a man who couldn't leave him. 2 women on a mountain who'd built something real from the wreckage of a thing that should never have been taken from them. There were people in Silas's life who would have called that luck. He'd thought about whether that was the right word for it, and had decided it wasn't, or not entirely. Luck was what you called it when the thing that happened to you was random and unearned. What had happened on that ridge had been random, yes, but what had come from it was not luck. What had come from it was what happened when people who were paying attention put what they had toward what mattered. He had paid attention. She had paid attention. Margaret had been paying attention for years before either of them arrived at the same table. That wasn't luck. That was people choosing, one small, honest thing at a time, to be worth what the accident had offered them. Years later, when people made the ride up the mountain road to the Rowan Mercer Ranch, because that was what it was called by then, on the hand-lettered sign at the bottom of the road, they found an operation that had grown past anything that could still reasonably be called simple. A proper clinic room built into the south end of the house. A second barn converted for longer-term patient care. Margaret's records, organized in a system that other medical practices had begun to ask about, and that Margaret declined to simplify because the complexity was the point. Eliza's name known through the territory not as the healer who'd been run out of Millhaven, but as the practitioner you went to when the official practitioners had given you something that didn't work. And a marshal who rode up and down a mountain trail and had, somewhere along the way, stopped needing to tell himself that stopping was not the same as quitting. He came home on a Friday evening in late fall to find the kitchen warm and supper almost ready, and Margaret winning at chess against a rancher's wife, who'd come for a consultation and stayed for the company, and Eliza at her desk writing in the particular focused way that meant she'd found something in the records that interested her, and Thunder's footfall in the pasture just audible through the wall, the steady, clean sound of an animal that had healed fully and intended to keep doing so indefinitely. He hung up his coat, sat down at the table. Eliza looked up from her writing. She looked at him the way she always looked at him, direct, honest, the full weight of it, and said, "Bad ride?" "No," he said. "Good one." "Hungry?" "Yeah." She went back to her writing.
Margaret said something to the rancher's wife that made her laugh loudly enough to surprise herself. Outside, thunder moved through the pasture in the long-last light. And Silas Mercer, who had been in motion for 8 years and had fallen off a mountain and found himself somewhere he hadn't been looking for and had chosen it anyway, sat at the table in the kitchen where the important things happened and understood, without needing to name it out loud, that this was the whole of what he had. Not perfect, not uncomplicated, not without the ongoing business of Voss and the medical board and the cases on his desk in Caldwell and the next hard thing that would come, because there was always a next hard thing, but true. Every part of it, true. That turned out to be enough. It turned out to be more than enough. It turned out to be the thing that, if you were paying attention and willing to stop running long enough to recognize it, was all anything ever needed to be.